Services for the municipality of Chatham-Kent. There's a bit of background leading into the study here. Back in 2017, through council direction at the time, administration sought out funding opportunities from senior levels of government for the various coastal flooding events and shoreline erosion issues occurring along the Lake Erie shoreline. It became apparent that there was no funding available from senior levels of government for area-specific shoreline management solutions at the time. However, administration did do some further research and brought forward an opportunity to participate as a partner in a federally funded study. So specifically in November of 2017, council officially endorsed its intent to be a partner in developing a Lake Erie shoreline study to address the effects of climate change on Lake Erie and the Great Lakes in general. So the project was promoted through Canada's Climate Change Adaptation Platform with financial support from Natural Resources Canada. Matching funds or in-kind support were also received from the municipality, the Lower Thames Conservation Authority, the province of Ontario, the federal government, and the International Joint Commission. Actual approval for the proposal and funding from the federal government was officially received in June of 2018, and the technical work began on the study in the latter part of 2018. Mr. Peter Zuzek of Zuzek Incorporated, in partnership with Linda Morsch from the University of Waterloo, were retained by the municipality to be the technical leads on the study. And this study represents the first time in Ontario that the projected impacts of climate change on coastal storms, future ice cover, wave energy, and lake levels were evaluated in a comprehensive coastal risk assessment. Certainly, we would like to thank all the partners who have contributed to the study. And throughout the study, community engagement has been a very important aspect. A specific web page was initiated for the study in March of 2019 on the Let's Talk Chatham-Kent online engagement site, where project updates and information has been shared all along the way. There have been approximately 2,700 visits to the site during this time. In addition to that, we had 3 separate rounds of community meetings in 2019, where over 1,000 people attended. Each session presented attendees with detailed historical, factual, and technical information. More importantly, participants were provided an opportunity to share their ideas and concerns on erosion and flooding challenges facing the Lake Erie shoreline. We'd certainly like to thank all those who did participate in the engagement sessions along the way. So the final results of the study were released through a media release on April 24th. Instructions on accessing the report were also emailed to all the individuals who had previously provided contact information at the public meetings. Therefore, in closing, I'd like to introduce Peter Zuzak to provide an overview presentation of the report. Mr. Zuzak is a professional geoscientist and a recognized shoreline expert in his field with over 30 years of experience managing complex multidisciplinary coastal investigations throughout North America and internationally. In addition to this, we've received a number of specific questions from the public regarding the report, and Mr. Zuzak will be addressing the questions as he goes through his presentation. So with that, I will turn it over to Mr. Peter Zuzak.
Okay, thank you, Bruce. Everyone can hear me okay?
Yes, we can, Mr. Zuzak.
And the screen is good? Okay, so we'll jump right into this. Thank you, Bruce, for...
Hi, Peter. It's Mike from IT. Sorry. Can you change your monitor to show the application, different monitor? You're in presentation view right now.
Okay. How's that now?
Still showing the same thing from our end.
Okay, so maybe you can walk me through again how we're show.
On the top under sharing, there should be a drop down.
Yes.
If you click, I believe it was show monitor 2 when we were doing the test.
Okay. How's
there
that?
we go.
We're good?
It's better. Yep.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Bruce, for the introduction, and through your worship, thank you, everybody, for the opportunity to present to you tonight. This has been a very important study for the community, and we certainly are honored and appreciate the opportunity to work with everyone along the way. It's been a tremendous effort a lot of support from the community attending the meetings, as Bruce highlighted, and we look forward to taking you through the slide deck here tonight. So first, before we get into the technical information, I'd like to acknowledge all of the study partners. The work was supported by Natural Resources Canada Climate Change Adaptation Program, as well as the municipality of Chatham-Kent. The Lower Thames Valley Conservation Authority was a very important partner throughout the work. We also, and this is some positive news, just recently received some additional funding for this effort from the Ministry of the Environment, Conservation and Parks and the ECP. And so I'm happy to report to everyone that we'll be able to continue to support this effort moving forward for the rest of the fiscal year until March 2021. So very, very pleased to be able to share that news with everyone and let everyone know that we'll continue to be available to help work with staff and council and the Conservation Authority as we move forward with this investigation and prioritize actions that will need to be taken. We also had a very large steering committee with representation from all levels of government, including members of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers and the International Joint Commission. So a large body there that helped guide the work. And I think most importantly, and certainly not lastly at the bottom, the entire community of Chatham-Kent were very, very involved, and we certainly enjoyed meeting everyone and appreciate all the feedback they provided to us throughout the study. As far as the presentation here tonight, we'll take this in some steps. We'd like to start with the review of climate change impacts on water levels and coastal storms, and then go through in detail the vulnerability and risk assessment that we've completed here for the Chatham-Kent Lake Erie shoreline. We'll certainly take some questions after those first two sections, and depending on the duration of the first aspect of the presentation here tonight, we may or may not take a break, short break. We'll then continue with part 4, where we'll review the community and government engagement to date, and then close with the adaptation recommendations by the 4 geographic regions. And then we'll take questions again at the end on parts 4 and 5. So starting with the climate change impacts on water levels and coastal storms. And as Bruce highlighted at the onset here, this is the first time that there's been a dedicated study with respect to climate change, looking specifically at the impacts of water levels and coastal storms and how that will affect the communities of the Great Lakes. And what I'd like to do is take everyone through the highlights of that work to share some of the key things that we've learned along the way. And so on the screen here, we have the historical water level range for Lake Erie, and that would be the squiggly blue line in the middle, going back from 1918 all the way forward to 2020. And we can see that we established this new all-time record high monthly mean lake level last June in 2019. And so lake levels have gone through these periods of highs and lows, and that's something that the community has been dealing with, and all the other communities around the Great Lakes for quite some time. What's really important here moving forward is understanding a couple of these dashed lines. So the orange line is what we refer to as the 1% chance flood level, also sometimes referred to as the 100-year flood level. And this is a water level that's used for planning purposes that has a probability of exceedance. In other words, could happen in any given year. The probability of that happening is 1%. And that's used for regulatory work and establishing flood setbacks by the Conservation Authority and others. And the orange line there is where that level was historically, and it before this study started, giving you the perspective of the historical extremes. And what we've been able to learn through the work that we've done, and as well as some very detailed work from Environment and Climate Change Canada, is that the best information we have moving forward, the projections for the impacts of climate change, is that these extreme levels, the orange line, for example, dashed line, is expected to become higher in the future. And the level we've selected is on the order, the red line there is a ½ meter higher. And so for this work that we're doing, we're using the historical flood level, 100-year flood level, which is the dashed orange line. But importantly, we want to look forward and account as best we can for the projected impacts of climate change. And all of that science points to looking at even higher highs in the future moving forward. There was a comment that we received on this very aspect of the future lake levels, and I want to just highlight it quickly, provide an answer. So there was a written comment about the impacts of evaporation on water levels. And the question was, if it's going to get warmer in the future, will that not result in more evaporation losses off the surface of the lake? And I think that's a very good point, and that's certainly something that can happen. But what all the science is telling us is that the amount of rainfall we're going to get in the future is going to outpace any of the evaporation losses from the lake surface. And so the rainfall is going to dominate. We're already getting more rainfall than we have historically, and that's what has the potential then to drive up the lake to levels even higher than what we received in 2019. There was also another comment written in that spoke to the question of water level regulation and the role that the International Joint Commission plays throughout parts of the Great Lakes, and specifically wondering why we didn't comment more on regulating the levels of Lake Erie to deal with these highs that are causing tremendous stress for all the communities around the Great Lakes. And the short answer there with Lake Erie is that there are no structures on Lake Erie that can be used to moderate the level of the lake. And so it is a natural system. The levels go up and down in response to supplies from the Detroit River, as well as all the local tributaries, and minus the water flowing out of the Niagara River. So we didn't get into the role of water level regulation because simply there's no way to moderate the level of Lake Erie. Okay, so on to our next slide here. Another really key finding, and this is something that we hear a lot about in the news, is the projected warming due to the impacts of climate change. And the top left-hand corner, we have a graphic here that shows the changes in the winter air temperatures across Canada in the last 70 years or so, and with the most dramatic change, the dark red colors being in the north and the far northwest regions. Zooming in a little bit to the region of interest here, again looking at the future, and so for the winter warming projection for the RCP 8.5 emission scenario, just for benefit, RCP 8.5 is assuming that we continue to emit carbon at the current rates we have historically. So it's essentially a status quo emission scenario. If we keep doing that, the projections for Southern Ontario, where we're interested in, are winters that are on the order of 5 to 7 degrees warmer. And this last year is a bit of a prelude to that, where we had a fairly mild winter. And for most part, Lake Erie didn't freeze, except for some of the shallow embayments and sheltered areas. And so what we're trying to highlight here in the graphics along the bottom are just schematically with some satellite images, the changes that have already been happening on Lake Erie. There's already been reductions in winter ice cover. The middle graphic being a scenario where only half of the lake is covered. And then the far right-hand image, again, just ice in the very eastern basin. So the science is telling us that as our climate continues to warm in the wintertime, the occurrence of ice is going to continue to decline to the point where by late century, which is the 2080 period, it's only about 60 years away, that we could be headed into a future where there is no longer ice cover on the lake in the wintertime. And so one of the key things that we did through this technical work was investigate what that means. And we saw it firsthand this year on Lake Erie with a lot of storm damage in the wintertime, with the lakes being at a very high level. With the graphic on the screen here, we went through quite a detailed technical exercise where we simulated the waves across the entire lake over a 10-year period, factoring in the historical conditions when we had a decent amount of ice cover on the lake. And then we fast forward to the future for this late century 2080 scenario that I mentioned, where we made the assumption that this lake would no longer have ice at all. And so we're using historical ice conditions versus a zero ice cover condition in the future to look into the potential impacts of climate change on the amount of exposure to storms. And what we see on the screen is what we call a heat map. And this is looking at the percent increase in the amount of wave energy and storms impacting the shoreline. And so dark reds here in the western basin of Lake Erie, where typically is a lot of ice cover in that portion because the lake is shallower. 120% increase in the amount of energy that would strike that shoreline in the wintertime. For the study area, it's on the order of 70 to 80% on either side of the Rondo Peninsula. And then because there is typically quite a heavy ice cover in the bay, if the Rondo Bay becomes ice-free in the future, a dramatic increase there as well in the amount of energy generated. And so this is something that we're quite concerned about from the standpoint of increasing the exposure of these communities, yours and all the rest on Lake Erie, to the effects of storms in the wintertime. And certainly in the winter when the lake is frozen and things are locked down, the amount of erosion typically decreases dramatically. If the lake has no ice in the future, then of course those erosion rates are going to increase significantly in the future as well. All right, and just a couple pictures here with respect to what happens in the winter when we don't have ice cover. And the one on the left is a local picture from Erie Shore Drive, where we have some terrible damage to some of the homes here when we don't have ice cover. The one on the right-hand side is not local, but gives you an idea of the amount of force that the winds can bring and the amount of potential structural damage to homes when they become covered in ice and the lake is not frozen across the open surface. All right, so that's the first part of the presentation, and those are of course just the highlights. There are some very large technical reports that are being finalized and will be available to provide even more information than the draft report that was recently circulated. We did all that work because prior to this investigation, we had no real good technical information on how to assess vulnerability and risk along the Lake Erie shoreline, both based on historical conditions, but also factoring in the impacts of climate change. And so what I'd like to do next with part 2 here is walk everyone through the highlights of the vulnerability and the risk assessment for the study shoreline. And first, there's some important background with respect to the vulnerability assessment. We're focusing on coastal erosion and flooding, the impacts of high lake levels. We've looked at traditional components of a risk assessment, including buildings and infrastructure that could potentially be damaged, as well as road infrastructure. We've also looked at the historical loss of wetlands in Rondo Bay and how that could become further impacted in the future. We're also looking closely at the navigation channel into Erie and the bay itself, as well as the commercial fishing fleet and the fuel dock. Some of the things that we haven't looked at, and I want to just be clear here, would be things like the interior contents of the buildings, damaged agricultural crops, social impacts due to natural disasters. And this is not to suggest that these are not important things. We just chose to focus on the elements in the included section so that we could work towards getting quickly to the adaptation aspects and focus on solutions. But certainly these types of natural disasters cause disruption to local businesses, and then there could be lots of secondary impacts as well. So I want to be clear that we do recognize that there can be the items that are in the not included list, but we focused on the traditional elements in the top. All right, so I'm going to take everyone through some of the regions here. So the The first graphic here is one we've shown several times. This is the entrance to Rondo Bay and the community of Erie back in 1955. And so the black and white photograph is an aerial image from 1955 when the community was still an active coal port. And of course, you can see the coal here on the inside of the bay. We choose this background because it helps tell the story of how this area has evolved from 1955 moving forward. And so on the west side of the west jetty here, there's been continuous growth or advance of the shoreline in the lakeward direction up until 2015. And so this structure has been trapping sand, and the beach has been getting wider and wider progressively here on the west side. If we jump to the other side of the navigation channel, it's the opposite story or the opposite trend because of the impacts of that sand being trapped. And so we have a much shorter east jetty here. From an old map, we have this dashed black line that gives us an estimate of where the shoreline was in 1868, so over 150 years ago. And then we have the red line, 1955. We have a series of the colored lines over the 70s and 80s and 90s. And then the green line at the top from 2018, which is the surveyed position before we had a breach in the barrier. And so quite a dramatic shift here in the position of the shoreline on the east side of the navigation channel. And the beach itself is eroded back almost 650 meters in that 150-year period. So we have an imbalance where the sediment's being artificially trapped on one side and causing quite a problem on the other side of the entrance to the navigation channel. Since the 1955 period, over 160 hectares of marshland have been lost in this region behind the barrier beach due to the retreat of that area and also the increased exposure of that area to wave energy. And then with a more recent backdrop here, this is the 2015 barrier beach. And for any of the boaters that might be on the call here, we will know that it doesn't look like this anymore in 2015. It's changed dramatically since then. The red line is what we surveyed in 2019 in August when we were out there. There was a breach in the center portion of the beach, and it's a very narrow little spit of sand. So there's some really important things happening here that are and the trends are not positive. We know everything is eroding back into the bay, but the sand itself is also migrating into the navigation channel. And so because the east jetty is no longer connected to the barrier beach and the island here, sand is spilling through this gap, filling in the sediment into the channel. But it also increases the amount of exposure for the fuel dock in the commercial fishing fleet. So this is a non-traditional, non-standard approach, and it's something that needs to be addressed moving forward. A couple more things on the ecosystem, and then we'll move on to some other geographies. The map on the top left-hand side, 1849, is an interesting historical map showing what Rondo Bay looked like, and at one point, the entire feature itself was a fringing wetland in a natural state. And now, of course, it doesn't look like that. It's a combination of a people and an environmental place. But because of that increased amount of erosion in that barrier beach, things are happening that are not natural. And the graphic on the lower left, here we have a floating cattail island that's eroded from behind the barrier, and it's been drifting around last summer in the bay itself. And as this area continues to suffer from these impacts, the species on the left, on the right-hand side, the spotted gar and the Fowler's toad, these species, which are found in only a few very select locations left in all of southern Ontario, are threatened as well. And so we have a trend here that's been pretty clear through the historical maps. This area is changing dramatically, and it's not changing for the good, it's changing for the bad. And then one last comment here on waves. And so a little bit of some local context here. The picture in the lower left-hand corner is the breach in that barrier beach back in August of 2019. So the lake is on the left-hand side, and you could drive a boat, shallow boat, right between that breach into the bay itself. And then the photos on the right-hand side were taken just this past winter. There's a new opening where the kayak is sitting in the lower right-hand corner. So these photos are looking towards the east. And so the barrier keeps moving, and it will continue to move unless there's some interventions. The risk, of course, is that it might completely disappear altogether. And what does that mean for the community? And so just a couple quick statistics here, information on wave height. So in the deep part of Lake Erie, offshore of Rondo, during a storm event, you could have waves that are on the order of 6 meters in height. So very large waves traveling in the deep part of the lake. If you have a healthy barrier and it's not breached like it currently is, the wave heights inside Rondo Bay are on the order of a 1 meter wave height. But with the technical work we've been able to do, if it continues to breach and if it disappears altogether as it is in the lower left-hand corner, the wave heights increase to at least 2.7 meters inside Rondo Bay. So we have a situation where this system is changing and it's increasing the risk exposure for the communities on the fringing inside of Rondo Bay, as well as impacting the wetlands and habitat. Okay, so moving on to the fuel dock and the commercial fishing fleet in the bottom corner. That breach or gap that I mentioned is, you can see in the lower right-hand corner here, where the east jetty is not connected to anything anymore, so the waves are coming right through. It's a problem for the fuel dock. It's a problem for the marinas. The fuel dock is flooded in this particular example. Did note that it's there's been some repairs done there, which have been great to raise up the elevations around that dock, and so it's nice to see some positive improvements there. I want to switch gears a little bit to the west now, and this is an old map that we were able to put together, dig up from the archives, and it's a map of the depths of the lake along Erie Shore Drive in 1938. So the tan colored map, you can see the rectangle. This was the old map. We used the software to make sure it was geographically referenced into the right location. And then we compared the depths in the lake to the information that we collected in the summer of last summer, 2019. So the examples here we'll show you are from line 7. So looking at the changes in the lake bottom over this long period of time. And so to orientate everyone, this would be the Erie Shore Drive dike here on the right-hand side between 500 and 550 on the x-axis. The road, and then schematically showing a home. What we have on the bottom, the gray line is what we surveyed in August. And so we see a large sandbar offshore here, a trough, and then another smaller sandbar closer to shore. We had to stop the boat in roughly about 470, 80 meters here because we couldn't get too close to the shore. The final measurements there for the depth of water, when we compare that to the 100-year climate change lake level, which is the dashed red line, we have a depth of 4.3 meters. So during an extreme storm event, during high lake levels, we have water depths in excess of 4 meters in front of Erie Shore Drive. And if we compare the black line, which is the information we're able to extract from the 1938 map, and compare the depths in that same region, and recognize that we didn't have to factor in climate change back in 1938, we had water depths during that same storm event of 2.2 meters. So with this type of information, we're able to characterize the increased risk exposure to places like Erie Shore Drive and others within the study area, and factor in how climate change are making these areas that are already vulnerable to coastal risks, of course, even more vulnerable moving forward. Okay, so next I'm going to go through some maps that are highlighting some of the flooding impacts. And so the series of maps here that are looking at the extent of flooding during that 100-year storm event, both with the historical extremes, but also factoring in the impacts of climate change. And just to orient everyone here, there's a key map on, if you can see it, on the lower right-hand corner. We're looking at the Holiday Harbor area, Erie Beach, top right, The lower left-hand corner is Erie Shore Drive, and then the Rose Beach line area. And so the areas of blue, of course, are where the models are predicting that the flood waters would go during that 100-year storm event. And if we fast forward to the next year, we can see this is the 100-year flood level with the additional ½ meter of climate change. And so when we toggle back and forth, we can see the increase in the amount of flood inundation that would happen down the road in the future with the influence of climate change. And then next panel is Erie, top left, Shrewsbury, Rondo Bay Estates, and the Summer Place in the lower right. So similar exercise. We have detailed elevation data of all these communities, and we're looking at the spatial extent of the flooding for these two flood scenarios. So the current one is the 100-year lake level based on historical data. And if we fast forward and look to the future and add that additional ½ meter due to the impacts of climate change, there's additional inundation. And it's quite prominent in some areas. If we look at the top left-hand corner with Erie, everything north of Ross Lane, there's some wet spots with the 100-year lake level. When you add in the additional ½ meter because of climate change, given how low everything is on the back side or the north side of Ross Lane, there's extensive additional flooding there. Shrewsbury, similar additional flooding. Rondo Bay Estates is an interesting one, and we've said this before, and it's worth mentioning again. This is a great local example of where strong regulatory efforts to make sure that this newer development is located above the 100-year flood level means that there's very little vulnerability during that storm events. In other words, all these homes are built high enough that they're okay. When you add in the climate change, additional ½ meter projection, though things start to get a little bit bad there in Rondo Bay Estates because it wasn't planned accordingly for that additional ½ meter. And then the Summer Place is a very wet place under both scenarios. All right, we've done some more analysis, and we just can show some of this quickly here for Erie Shore Drive, looking at a little more detail, a little higher resolution, so we can see the extent of the flooding. And this has obviously been very well documented, and actions have been taken to reduce the risks here. Top areas, the 100-year flood level. When you add the additional ½ meter to factor in climate change, you essentially have water that's flowing right across this entire barrier system because it's relatively low lying compared to other parts of the study shoreline. So again, just some important information for us to understand how that risk profile can change when we factor in the climate change. All right, next slide is the just looking at the spatial extent of the flooding. So these, again, these blue areas in behind Erie Shore Drive and the Burke drainage scheme are the amount of inundation that you could have in the interior lands if there was a breach in the dike along Erie Shore Drive. And so again, these scenarios assume that there's a breach, the water is able from the lake to flow through and flood the interior lands and the farmlands. And so we have 568 hectares potentially impacted if the lake breached at the historical 1% chance flood level, 100-year level. That goes up to 647 if you're factoring in the potential for higher highs in the future due to climate change. Just one quick note, there was a question from an individual about getting some information from these maps to be able to further assess their specific lot. In other words, how do these flood surfaces potentially affect my home, which is an important question. And I wanted to just make the point that the maps that you've just seen include the ones, the 4-paneled maps were not generated to at the scale to help someone specifically evaluate a single lot. But there are plans in the future moving forward, working with the Conservation Authority to develop the type of detailed mapping where individual lots could be assessed. So that's not something that's readily available right now, but there are plans to make that kind of mapping, to generate that type of mapping in the future, and then make that available for people. Okay. So next slide here, just slide 25. We, again, with the light shining on the Erie and the Erie Shore Drive area, we've looked very carefully here at the amount of inundation to the road network. And so the top panel is the 100-year flood level. And as we've written in the report, and I think it's fairly common knowledge now, the road into Erie, which is Erie Road, if the dikes were to breach, there's on the order of a meter or more of water just to the northwest of Medici Pond over that road. So in other words, the road itself is completely inundated. Not only is it not passable for emergency vehicles, but it's certainly not passable for anybody else either. So ingress and egress is not available to anybody if the dike breaches during that 100-year flood event, as you can see in the top graphic. And for the lower panel graphic, same scenario, the assumption that there's a breach in the dike at Erie, or in some cases, as you can see here, there's water spilling right over the current situation at Erie Shore Drive. So in other words, water can enter in behind the dike without even a breach when you factor in that additional ½ meter due to climate change. And then the worst spot, again, just before the pond, you have on the order of 1.5 meters of water over across the road, Erie Road, the only ingress and egress route to and from the village. So this is a very serious concern. When you can't get emergency vehicles in and out, you can't get people in and out, something that's a very serious concern and risk for the community. Okay, moving to some of the economics now to put this in context. So what are we talking about with respect to the number of buildings and their value? The graphic on the screen is showing property parcels with the dashed black lines, and then we have buildings here. The P's are for primary buildings, S's are for secondary buildings. And so with the staff from Chatham-Kent, we built up this database to represent all the at-risk buildings within the study area along the shoreline of Lake Erie and Rondo Bay. And so we know where the buildings are, we know the land elevations of those buildings, and we know which ones are potentially impacted by the flooded surface, which is the light blue colors here in the example. So looking at both the number of affected buildings, which is the y-axis, the y1 axis here for the 100-year flood level, 3 or 4 areas really jump out at us. Erie Shore Drive, over 100 buildings with assessed value, which is on the y2 axis here at over $15 million. The community of Erie, 100 properties with assessed value approaching $15 million. Shrewsbury, even more homes here, over 175 homes, assessed value of in the order of $10 million. As I mentioned before, Rondo Bay Estates, largely a success story here because of good regulatory work to make sure those newer developments are built in safe locations. And then the Summer Place with the trailers and movable structures, over 100 and on the order of $3 or $4 million. So big numbers here, lots of things impacted by the historical 100-year flood level. And if we factor in that additional ½ meter of climate change, we get the second graph here. And so just to toggle back and forth, the axes, the y axes on both sides are the same scale. So you get a sense of how the risk profile changes when we factor in these higher projected lake levels on Lake Erie. And so more potential damage on Erie Shore Drive, a dramatic shift in the community of Erie. And so we're down around 100 buildings for the 100-year lake level. When you add that additional ½ meter, over 350 buildings impacted by that flood scenario. So a huge shift, huge increase. Pretty large increase in Shrewsbury as well, a little bit under 180 or so, and it's over 400 buildings, primary and secondary buildings affected by that flood level if it happens in the future and the lake reaches a ½ meter higher level than it did last summer. Okay, so just to keep moving here. That type of information on the flooding throughout the study area is what some of the key inputs that we use to develop the adaptation concepts. What I want to do next is shift to erosion. And we have quite a bit of information here, so I'll walk everybody through what we're looking at. The map, 3 panels here. Number 1, top panel is corresponding to a section of the Talbot Trail. The area 2, again, Talbot Trail further to the east, same with number 3. So these are the high bluff environments. You can see the eroding bluff face, hopefully, in the graphics. This is the sections where Talbot Trail is very close to the cliff edge, and the top image, number 1, is near Coatsworth Road, where the road is currently closed because of the erosion threat. What we've done with the yellow line, the thick yellow line, is make an estimate of where we expect the top of bank to be in the future over the next 50 years because of ongoing erosion. So we're using the historical rates of change and projecting those into the future to look at, if these bluffs keep moving at the rates they did historically, where will that top of bank line be? And there's, of course, some uncertainty in it, which is why the line is not a thin single line, but it's a thick yellow bar. And areas that we've highlighted here with the dash red are areas where the roads would be potentially impacted in the future within that 50-year planning horizon, or in the case of Coatsworth, already impacted. And then if we move to the next slide here, slide 30, we have the section number 4 there, which is the bluff line area, where the road's already been moved once, a significant area where that top of bank line is going to move inland and potentially threaten buildings. The lower image, of course, is Rose Beach line, and an area that's already been closed now for several years because of the erosion of the bluff. So this information is very helpful for us to understand what type of infrastructure and the amount of it, the length of it, that will be impacted in the future due to climate change. The couple important points to mention here, these rates of erosion were calculated with information that was from 2015, so they don't factor in the most recent accelerated erosion that's been occurring along the shoreline. But the other really important factor is that, as I showed at the first section, with the projected decrease in ice cover, there's a very strong possibility that erosion rates are going to accelerate in the future. And so these yellow lines across the maps here showing you the future top of bank, they do not factor climate change in any way yet. And so that was a 50-year estimate based on historical erosion. And if these projections play out, though climate continues to get warmer and we get less ice cover in the winter, that yellow line is something less than a 50-year estimate, and potentially quite a bit less than a 50-year estimate. Now, just to take a deep breath here, there was another written comment on this section of the presentation, identifying the fact that there are other roads and infrastructure that are threatened that are not shown in these 2 slides, and that's a very good point. There are places where there are roads that are impacted by flooding in low-lying areas. So what I've walked everyone through here is the impacts that are being calculated, looked at in the high bluff environments where erosion is a dominant process, but there are certainly other places with Erie Shore Drive, for example, where there are roads and dikes that are vulnerable. It's just that the driving process there is more related to flooding than erosion. Okay, so in a similar way, this is a bit of a schematic showing you how we assess these impacts. And so the dashed lines are property parcels. We have the lake on the bottom of the image here. We're showing Lake Erie. The 2 blue lines would be the toe of the bluff, the top or the crest of the bluff where it flattens out. And then we have this estimate, in this case, the dashed green line, of a 50-year position for that top of bank. And recognizing that it could be less than 50 years because of the impacts of climate change. what we've done in this analysis is gone through and, as we're showing in the screen here, characterize where that future estimate on the top of the bank will impact both primary and secondary buildings. So we've done this throughout the entire area where erosion is the dominant process. And the next graphic is highlighting some of those results. And so we've broken it up into 3 geographic areas, starting off in the section here from Wheatley Provincial Park to Campbell Road. And Talbot Trail is not close to the lake. And we have, in this 50-year or less planning horizon, close to 150 buildings, primary and secondary buildings, impacted by that erosion, with the assessed values. This would be 2019 assessed values of a little bit less than 20 million. If we move to the middle portion here, which is the section where the Talbot Trail is very close to the bluff edge, and we have a lot of development along the edge of the bluff as well, we have on the order almost 300 buildings, primary and secondary buildings, that are hypothetically impacted by a do-nothing approach to this erosion problem, and they have assessed value of over $40 million. And then if we skip to the far east, so the area to the northeast of Rondo Provincial Park, we have high bluffs there as well. They're eroding at a similar rate, but there's a lot less development in that eastern portion of the study area. And so under this 50-year estimate, the number of homes, buildings impacted is considerably less, on the order of 40, with a assessed value of 8 or 9 million. I want to be clear, because there was some comments about this as well. It doesn't mean that it's not a severe impact on the east side. There's just less infrastructure close to the lake on the area to the east of Rondo than there is to the west. Okay, so Your Worship, and that is part 1 and 2, and we have agreed to take some questions and get some feedback on the slides we just presented.
So calling on questions now, Councillor Latimer.
Goodness, I didn't think I'd be the first one on the draw. Thank you very much, Peter, for clarifying those important highlights of that study. I just had a question coming from the community. You were saying, with regard to the International Joint Commission, there are no structures on Lake Erie to currently moderate the lake levels, but could we build a structure? And if we could, how much would that cost us?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. It's something that's been looked at for many decades. I've personally been involved in numerous studies with the IJC, but there's reports that go back to at least the 1930s, looking at the construction of additional dams and other infrastructure to further regulate the levels of the Great Lakes, and including some recent information that was generated by the IJC-led studies, which is including both the federal government in Canada and the United States. And at this point, they've concluded that there is no how to put it, these would be their words, they're not pursuing any further structural intervention. So some of the written comments we received were asking, why didn't we consider this? Because the message coming from the IJC pretty loud and clear is that there is no intention to build further structural intervention to moderate lake levels in the Great Lakes. So that's the reason we chose not to focus on it. And one of the things that I do like to share with people is that even though the level of Lake Ontario is regulated by the outflows at the Moses Saunders Power Dam in Cornwall, in 2017 and 2019, Lake Ontario itself hit record highs, both years, successive highs. So just having a dam or a structure is not something that's going to guarantee there won't be challenges with water supplies in the future. And essentially, again, I of course don't speak for the IJC, but through their publications, what they're encouraging communities and landowners to do is to focus on building resilience to fluctuating water levels, not counting on them to build more structures.
Thank you very much. I think we should maybe at this time remind viewers that there is a Great Lakes and St. Lawrence high water levels, what to expect for the 2020 flooding season, and that's actually being put on through the Great Lakes and St. Lawrence Initiative this Thursday. Can we maybe post that to our website? I know the councillors got the information, Judy, or ask the clerk if we could put that on the website for our viewers to see.
Yes, thank you, Councillor Latimer. I'll work with administration on that.
Okay, I see no one else want any questions. Oh, Councillor Oche, followed by Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Mr. Zuzak. The gentleman, Mr. Vanek, put in a letter asking about wave breakers. What is your suggestion or your thoughts on that?
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think sounds like the question or the comment is regarding structures being built in the lake. Sometimes they're referred to wave breaks, breakwaters is the more technical term. We have looked at that. There's a section in the report that speaks to some of the concepts that were evaluated and not considered further for the adaptation concepts. The one disadvantage of the wave structures to break waves, including offshore breakwaters, is that they're incredibly expensive to construct. They're typically the most expensive option to try to dissipate waves. And even though they're in the lake and they can break up wave energy, they still have gaps in between them, which means there still is energy getting to the shore, which means you still have to do something along the shoreline as well. So they are often mentioned, but I want to be clear for everyone, they're by far the most expensive option because you have to build them in the water. Everything is done with a barge, and they don't stop all the energy. And so you still need a solution right at the water's edge. And then that drives the cost up even further. So we did do some costing on this. We looked at a cross section for Erie Shore Drive, and it was put into the report. And it quickly became even more expensive than the options that include the rock revetments, which we put in the report. So for those reasons, we chose not to pursue this type of option for this shoreline.
I believe we do have some along the lake now, do we not, on the higher road?
I am not familiar with any rock structures that are in the lake.
They almost look like kind of like a jack that when you were a kid and you'd play with the ball on jacks and you'd bounce the ball and pick up the jacks. If I'm not mistaken, and they're just put out into the water itself, like not a formal wall or anything like that. It's just I believe there's some just as you come out of Erie Beach itself and are going around the curve, but just before you get to the road drops.
I believe that there was some written comments on that as well. Personally, I'm not familiar with them. I've not seen them. I think that with the options we've put together here, and this goes back to the feedback we've received from all the public meetings, we wanted structures that were permanent, that had high durability, and that would protect private property. And from the work that we've done in this study and elsewhere, it was our opinion that the solutions that are building rock structures right at the edge of the lake are going to be the best option moving forward.
All right, thank you.
Yeah, just maybe one other quick comment on it though. They do work in some locations, but they typically need to be in locations where there's also it's shallower, but also a lot more sand supply. So because the shoreline is mostly a clay shoreline with small narrow beaches, they're not really an ideal solution for this area. But thank you for the question, though.
Thank you. Thank you.
Councillor Thompson, followed by Councillor Sakachi.
Thank you very much. Back to, I believe there are slides 29 and 30. You made mention that the erosion, that yellow line along Talbot Trail, and yeah, those ones, that was taken from 2015 numbers, and you said 2018 numbers seem to show some accelerated erosion. How much more accelerated are we talking about in those areas?
Yeah, that's a great question, and there's a plan to try to get out and be responsible with some social distancing to take some measurements with the conservation authority. So we've been talking about getting some updated information, because the image on the screen there, the air photograph, is from 2015, and so we don't actually have any information that tells us where that top of bluff is right now. And we know, and we've heard, and we've seen photos that there's been some dramatic rates of change in the last couple of years. And so there is a plan, and this would be one of those things that would fall under the additional scope that we've been able to put together with the additional funds from the province, where we will go out with the conservation authority with an appropriate safety plan and measure some of these top of bank locations and be able to report back on just on whether there has been a change and whether it would change these rates and to what degree. So I don't have an answer, but we do have a plan to get some of that information.
All right. Just to further to that, looking at the map here, obviously you've got the yellow line there, which is the 50-year hazard kind of area. And in a couple of slides, or a couple of instances, I mean, it comes right up basically to the edge. Now, I know you're not a road engineer or anything like that, but from your perspective, what's the level of setback you would need from, say, the top of the bluff to a road to feel comfortable?
Yeah, that's a great question. And that would be a geotechnical engineer to give you the proper technical answer there, but it's tied into the slope stability. Slope stability will vary spatially based on geology, groundwater tables, also the height of the bluff as well. So areas that are higher can fail more catastrophically. So the higher the bluff, the greater the distance should be. I don't know if I'm going to wade in there with a number, because that's not really my expertise. But the one thing I will say is that you can't wait until that yellow line gets right to the edge of the bluff. You need to have a much greater factor of safety there. And the reason for that is that it's not the edge of the cliff that's moving back. And you can see in the middle graphic here where you have that cliff edge. When those bluffs fail, we've all seen some of the photographs being posted, it's not, some cases it's not just another foot or two. You can lose 10, 20, 30 feet in one failure. Or you can have locations, and there's one here in the center panel, if people can see it, where there's been a gully that's been formed here. So these things can happen rapidly, and they need to be accounted for. And when roads get close to the bluff edge, it's already too late. So it's not something to treat lightly. And again, you need to build in a factor of safety here so that the bluff could still fail and the road could still be safe.
Right. Okay. That's kind of what I was alluding to. I have a couple of constituents on the AD Shad, or right at the end there, and they've lost 40 feet in the last year or two, I would say. So, I mean, when I look at in that slide that's shown in section 2 and 3, I would expect that it's not just those red lines. It's pretty much the entire section that we would have to be concerned about. The only final question for Mr. Zuzik would be coming in from someone in regards to Erie Shore Drive. I think Councillor Oche was referring to something called a tetrapod. At least that's what they're passing along. Does that ring any bells for you, Mr. Zuzik, in regards to the potential for there being tetrapods used, or even some of them already in the Erie Shore Drive area? That would be news to me.
Yeah, I mean, I am familiar with the tetrapods. I've seen them a few places over at Point Pelee National Park. There's some that are still visible in the water. I think that they're really not a viable solution for the reasons I mentioned previously. But the other one that people need to be aware of, and we don't really talk about that in this slide deck quite a bit, but not only are the bluffs eroding along these sections and at Erie Shore Drive, but it's also the bottom of the lake as well. So every time the wind blows, every time you have a significant storm and the lake turns to chocolate milk, that's the bottom of the clay surface on the lake eroding in response to the waves and the currents and the breaking wave energy. And so when you put something on the lake bottom tomorrow, for example, it's no guarantee it's going to be there in a year from now. The bottom's continually getting lower. They can be moved around by ice, etc. So I just don't see them as a durable long-term solution, and that's why we have not pursued them for this study.
All right, thank you.
You're welcome.
Councillor Sakachi, followed by Councillor McGrail.
Thank you, through your worship. Mr. Zuzak, I greatly appreciate the detail in the report, especially from a comprehension level. I found that you made it very, somewhat refreshing that we could actually interpret the report. Actually, many of my questions have been answered by Councillor Thompson because we have an EA waiting for Coatsworth, and we've heard a lot of concerns from the public, and there's a lot of businesses on that road. I had some of the similar questions. To spare time, I'm not going to re-ask them, but I just wanted to touch base. If you can just kind of go over a quick review of what would happen to the bluffs, so to speak, because this question came into me from a member of the public. If the water would drop significantly, how would that affect the bluff areas along Talbot Trail? If you don't mind just commenting on that really briefly.
Mm-hmm. Sure. Well, this is something that's been documented in the literature. It's pretty well known. If the water levels drop, and people that are familiar with the shoreline will know that the beaches can come back in some cases. And there certainly would have been beaches along some of these shorelines at the base of the bluffs in the period of, say, 2000 to 2010. But the one point that ties into my earlier comment about these clay shorelines, they erode all the time, regardless of what the water levels are. And so when the water levels are low, and you may have a narrow beach at the base of these clay bluffs, the bottom of the lake is taking the brunt of all the storms, and the bottom of the lake is getting deeper and deeper over time. And then when water levels come back up and they become high again, which is the current situation we have, the beaches disappear and the waves are breaking directly on the bluff slopes themselves, and they're eroding at a rapid rate in some cases, as we see now. And they also, the high lake levels tend to correspond to periods of course, greater precipitation, because that's what's driving the lakes up. So the bluffs themselves have more moisture in them, more groundwater, so they're much more unstable during high lake levels. So I think the point, a key point I would like to make for everyone's benefit is that it's something I've said many times before, is that the erosion never stops along these shorelines. The water levels just dictate where the erosion will occur. And so as we move forward with the plans, during low lake levels, it's the bottom of the lake eroding and getting deeper. And then when levels come back up, it's the bluffs themselves. So there's no holiday from erosion that happens all the time on these shorelines. It can slow down for the cliffs themselves when the water levels go down. But that doesn't mean it's not going to reaccelerate again, because the bottom of the lake is continually wearing away during these periods of low lake levels.
Thank you very much, Mr. Zuzak. I greatly appreciate your responses. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Councillor McGrail.
Thank you, Mayor Canoff. My question, it pertains to the map where you showed us the study area, and it gave us the different regions. So as we move forward, and as I'm, learning as we go here, as everyone else, I guess, through the study and everything, I've quickly, I think, come to the conclusion that, this defense has to be across the shoreline, right? Because any kind of breach is a detriment to their neighbors or down the road. So my question is, as we put forward Erie Shore Drive, we'll talk about that right now, that how will the detriment of Rondo Provincial Park, if they do nothing, how will that affect Erie Shore Drive if it does at all?
Mhm. Okay, yeah, well, great question. And definitely the concept, and we use the term community scale adaptation options a lot, and scale is really important in a study like this. And often in the past, things are done at a very small scale to lot by lot, and it's been shown in the past, and certainly with this study, that's not the best approach, and in some cases it's not even viable. So scale is really important. Community or regional scale approaches where everybody is doing the same thing and there is a consistent plan is really important. With respect to Rondo Provincial Park, because of where it's located, the east of Erie, there's really no direct linkage to Erie Shore Drive. However, the plans with the provincial park and the tip of the park and how they choose to manage their lands moving forward, which used to connect to the federal navigation channel, there are definitely issues there where cooperation and collaboration is needed by everyone that's a stakeholder in that geography, which includes the marina basins, the fuel dock, the commercial fishing fleet, as well as the communities inside Rondo Bay that don't want to see 3-meter waves rolling in through that bay because the shore are not designed to take on that kind of energy, as well as all the habitat in the park. So I will touch a little bit later on some of the ideas for how the community can continue to collaborate together, multiple parties on that area, so that hopefully people will work together to come up with a solution.
Great, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Seeing no other questions, I'll pass it over to Judy.
Mr. Zuzak, are you okay to proceed, or do you need 5 minutes?
I would like to have 5 minutes if we could.
Sure. Council, if everyone could just mute, and if we can just all be back for 7:15, that'll give Mr. Zuzak a chance for a quick break and anyone else who needs it. So we'll see everybody at 7:15.
Mr. Zuzak, are you ready to continue part 4?
Yes, I am, Your Worship.
All right, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So we jump back in, part 4, community and government engagement. I just mentioned that there's quite a few additional comments coming, so I'll be stopping for the slides and again, providing some context for some of the questions and comments we received from the community over the last couple of days. So on to part 4. There we go. All right, so as Bruce highlighted at the beginning, we had series of 3 meetings, engagements with the community, and total of 9 separate meetings, roughly 1,000 people in attendance, and some really great feedback received throughout the process, and certainly very grateful to all of the comments that we received, both in person during the working groups, and you can see some of the roundtable groups on the right-hand side of the image. I think there was a real positive spirit of cooperation at those meetings. So that's something that we're very grateful for. One of the key things that came out of that, and we specifically asked the people for their feedback on the evaluation criteria. And so the graphic on the left, the bar chart across the bottom, we have the various things that were identified as being important to the members of the community, and then the number of respondents that actually highlighted that as being something that was important to them. And so the far left there, protect property, almost 80% of the people indicated that was a very important evaluation criteria. Permanence and durability, again, also highlighted as a critical aspect. People have lived along the lake long enough and are knowledgeable enough to know that if you don't do it right, it's not going to last. Affordability for the landowner, highlighted again. Protection of human health, maintaining natural shoreline health, preserving coastal ecosystems, etc. So this information both guided the development of the adaptation concepts, but also helped us make our decisions on the recommendations as well. All right, and also wanted to say a little bit about engagement with the senior levels of government. And so just quickly, we'll go through here. Back in August of 2019, there were numerous meetings with the staff from the municipality and the provincial ministers at the Association of Municipalities of Ontario meeting in Ottawa. So a lot of dialogue there. The Premier's special advisor on flooding was engaged back in September of 2019. The Minister of Agriculture was on Erie Shore Drive back in September. There's been a continuous discussion with your two MPPs as well. Dave Epp, the MP, was in attendance at the November 26 meetings, both afternoon and evening. So pretty extensive engagement there. One of the messages that came back, and this is not great news for the private landowners, but the one thing we did hear generally and pretty loud and clear from them is that the senior levels of government typically don't provide funding for private shoreline protection structures. Now, that doesn't mean that they may not choose to wade in at some point in the future for a broader context or in a larger community scale initiative. But that was one of the key messages that came back. The other thing that we've reported on already in the past too is that there currently were no standing programs to help people pay for private shore protection or fund these larger scale initiatives. So we asked, and unfortunately at the time in the fall, there were no standing programs that were going to help in the immediate term. I also want to just highlight the Southwestern Ontario Shoreline Roundtable. So this is something spearheaded by Chatham-Kent, and your CAO, Don Shropshire, was chairing this group. And this came about recognizing that it wasn't just Chatham-Kent, but really everyone in Southwestern Ontario over the last couple of years has been. And I think we did a pretty decent job here of engaging with senior levels of government. We back to us in June that you need to get out there and talk to senior levels of government. So we did that. We just spoke bigger than the people of Chatham-Kent can tackle in some cases on their own. And so there will be recommendations. And this is really the heart of the presentation. Everything we presented previously was really to set the context here. And what I will do, process, Region 2 includes Erie Shore Drive and Erie Beach. Number 3 are the communities inside of Rondo Bay, as well as Erie-O, and then Region 4 is the navigation channel. So we broke things apart into these different geographies. We talked, firstly, this is a planning study. And so as you plan to deal with these challenges across the community, it's important to look at the full spectrum of options. In other words, everything should be on the table at the beginning. We also have not optimized these ideas and concepts of these different options. We touched on already the community scale being the focus, and also the goal of increasing the resilience of the community to options, but there are a whole host of alphabetic options where we provide recommendations that could be done where there's maybe only 1 or 2 homes that have a options featured a design life of 20 to 50 years. So that's something we'll talk more about when we get to Erie shorelines, is that you're never really finished with shoreline protection. It's an ongoing challenge and you need to do maintenance. If so, we wanted to just highlight that these concepts, especially the ones that have strong engineering focus, structural interventions, will certainly require continuous maintenance moving forward. And there was a comment that came in last couple of days around the term community scale and community consensus. And what do we mean by community consensus? And really that is all benefiting parties. So when I speak through the slides here and talking about community-based decisions and moving forward as a community, it's really all of the benefiting parties. And that may be private landowners along the lake or on the bay, as well as the municipality or other entities of government that own lands, etc. So when I mention community, it's not a term that we're strictly limiting to private landowners, for example. All right, and then a little bit of information on costs. Because of course costs are so critically important here, and as everyone has come to realize, the costs are all very, very high. The first point here to make is that we refer to these as concept level opinions of cost. And there's some good reasons for that, and ties back to my earlier point about that this is a planning level study. We're not ready to put a shovel in the ground and start building any of this. We haven't done all the fine detailed engineering and planning works to know exactly what these concepts will include. So there are opinions of cost. We also factor in what it would cost to do the engineering work in the future, as well as go through and do the permitting and the tendering and the construction observations to make some of these projects happen. We've added 4% for cost indexing, assuming that it would take several years before you might actually build one of these projects. And we've also included a contingency of 20% to provide that high cost range. And so for those that had a chance to go through the report and the appendices, you'll note that most cases we're providing a range of costs. It's not a single number, but it's a cost 20 to 30 million, for example. And then just again, the point on maintenance, that it's something that always has to be factored in the future. So we'll start in the west and region 1A, which is the Wheatley, Detroit line and Pier Road area. See the entrance to Wheatley Harbor on the far left here. Generally speaking, especially compared to other parts of the shoreline, the vulnerability is low here, or much lower than other geographic areas. And so our options here is a recommendation is option C, which is maintaining existing shoreline protection structures. The middle photograph is a typical shot of some of the shoreline in this area, where you've got a mixture of vertical walls and the rock structures and some pocket beaches. Moving forward, our recommendation would be to move away from these vertical walls because they're very reflective and they cause scour at the base of them, to more of a sloping rock structure, which is what you see in the far right-hand graphic. So that's accommodate, in essence, protect what you have and make sure you do the maintenance moving forward on the shoreline protection structures. And then there's the provincial park, Wheatley Provincial Park, and I'm sure most people are familiar with the rapid erosion that's been occurring along that park shoreline. It's been quite dramatic, anecdotally over 20 meters of erosion in a year and a half. And some locations, the road is not accessible now by vehicle traffic coming into that former day use area. So looking ahead and sort of being strategic, which is one of the things we want to do with this study, is recognizing that if nothing's done, if we continue down the road with the provincial park of essentially not taking action, not being proactive with the shoreline, we're going to run into a collision course down the road here where this feature, that's the narrow peninsula that separates the East Creek, is going to become an island. It's going to continue to erode, and we're going to get a situation where portions of Holiday Harbor and whatnot are going to be challenged because there's no going to be a provincial park anymore. So this recommendation is one where we're suggesting that, again, more effort is needed to pull together the right stakeholders here, including the provincial government, parks, provincial park staff, to work with everyone affected to come up with a longer term strategy for this area. All right, so next, moving to Region 1B, and this is the high bluffs from Wheatley Provincial Park all the way over to Erie Beach, but not including Erie Beach. And for those that had a chance to look at the report, we did consider a shoreline armoring concept here. It was very, very expensive, $600 to $900 million. And what we ultimately came back with a recommendation, which is option 1-3, which is to relocate the Talbot Trail and the buildings inland. And so what that concept involves is that inside this large, purposely large shaded area here, that there would be a new alignment found for the Talbot Trail, where it could be built in a safe manner away from erosion for several hundreds of years, and the buildings themselves would be relocated when the risk gets to be too high and moved further inland as well. And so looking at the breakdown of the costs, the realignment of the road further inland was somewhere in the order of 35 million, and roughly 500 buildings would need to be relocated over that 50-year planning horizon, or potentially less than 50 years because of climate change. And we factored in the cost to pick up and move those buildings and purchase a new small lot in a safe location to put them somewhere in the interior. The cost for that was 33 to 62 million. So the total cost for this option, 68 to 96 million. Just for context, the image on the far right-hand corner is over near the community of Port Bruce, and they recently have done a very large, not quite to this scale, but a pretty large realignment of Dexter Line. And so Dexter Line, it used to follow this yellow area here, and they moved it over 800 meters inland to a new safe alignment to deal with the erosion issues. So this is not an easy concept to reach to and sort of to present because of the implications. But when you compare it to the cost of trying to armor the shoreline, it's on the order of about 10% of what it would cost to try to harden the shoreline and keep Erie Shore Drive in the same place. So something to protect the shoreline. And the notes that we have here suggesting that, again, because of these criteria that we were given and we developed with the community around durability and permanence and long-term protection, it was our opinion that the best approach, if you're going to protect the shoreline, is with these large armor stone structures, a big rock revetment. The problem with that, though, is it's incredibly costly to build. So it's not that we didn't consider other options, it's just something that's going to work and meet some of those key criteria of permanence, et cetera. It needed to be that concept of the rock revetment. There was also someone wrote in that asked if they had a property that had a home and the home was condemned, and asked whether there might be some retroactive compensation planned for someone who's already lost a building along the bluff area. And I guess unfortunately at this point, there is no plans for any type of compensation, either current or retroactive. So wanted to just touch on that as well. A couple more. Someone also wrote in and they liked the idea of the Talbot Trail realignment and commented that it might be it'd be an opportunity to really recreate this route, one where it had better access to cycling lanes in it, and possibly trying to highlight and do a better job at marketing and selling local fruits and vegetables, recognizing that in this current world we're in, that growing food locally and eating it and buying it locally is going to continue to be really important, and that's something that this committee does a great job of. So that was some feedback there on this one. And one other, well, a couple more. One of the people that wrote in indicated that the revetment option that we did not recommend was much more expensive along the Talbot Trail than it was for Rose Beach Line, for example. And the reason for that is that the bluffs are much higher here than they are along Rose Beach Line. And that means a very different engineering approach where you need to regrade the slope, deal with groundwater and slope stability. And so it's a much more complicated design because of the heights of the bluffs in this area. And then I think the last one, someone also mentioned that that the municipality should reach out and ask the property owners what they thought would be the best approach and what they thought about the retreat of the Talbot Trail, for example, whether they would be willing to contribute financially to a solution. So I think that that's certainly something that council might choose to do, but I believe that there's also the environmental assessment that's underway for this realignment, and I think that that would be also an opportunity for the landowners to provide their feedback. Okay, so moving on. So the next region is the Bates Line Drive, Rose Beach Line over to McKinley, but not including the McKinley stretch. So this is the area to the northeast of the Rado Provincial Park entrance. Again, an area not without any problems, but generally much lower vulnerability than other portions of the study area. We didn't develop a community scale solution here because we didn't think we needed one, but we did come up with a series of our alpha options here, which include considering higher regulatory standards to ensure we don't have problems in the future, looking at existing zoning where you have challenges, maintaining shoreline protection structures where you have them, where you have the few lower properties, looking at on a lot by lot basis, raising grades and or foundations to deal with the localized flood risk. And then if needed, relocating buildings in the future. Okay, and now on to Region 1D, which is Rose Beach Line between McKinley Road and Hill Road. And so an area that's had been dealing with the road closure for quite some time. And right in this region here, we looked at multiple options here, including things that were outlined in the draft environmental assessment that started. And our ultimate recommendation was what we would call a strategic retreat. And that would be working to decommission Rose Beach Line between McKinley and the Antrim Road section, and then all the way over to Hill Road, so that ultimately that road will be decommissioned. There would be upgrades to New Scotland Line, so the area in red here, so this becomes an appropriate artery with the necessary bridges and whatnot and safety factors built in. And then for the existing homes that are located along the lake, these little red lines are at the planning level, the construction of new roads so that they would have access to some of the existing arteries, like moving along McKinley Road or Antrim Road, or in the case of the three or four lots to the north of the current closure, the northern orange line would provide some type of access through an easement or whatever would be appropriate to get them into the park itself and have access to New Scotland Line. So we don't have all the details of how these road alignments will work. That's not the the level of detail you would go to with this kind of planning study, but want to be clear that by decommissioning the road, no one is left without safe access away from the lake and up to New Scotland Line. That would be a critical part of the plan. The cost for this option was 12.1 to 14.6 million. And there was a comment on this one, and I think essentially I addressed it already, so we can move on. All right, so Region 1E. So this is, again, the Hill Road all the way over to the east study boundary. So this is the section that everyone will recall where the amount of erosion and the number of buildings was at a much lower level than the Talbot Trail section, for example, to the west of Erie Beach. And so in this geography, we came up with a series of our alpha options here, looking at planning level approaches where, for example, higher regulatory standards could be put in place so that we don't end up with more homes being built too close to the eroding edge. Option F there is relocating buildings and land when they become threatened. And then option G here, if there is that continuous desire to build on the edge or near the edge and take advantage of the views, maybe there's a way to build something into this where those buildings are being purpose-built that they can be moved readily when the risks become too great. So trying to be proactive with future planning and still allowing people to enjoy the views and the lake. I want to be really clear on this one because there's some written feedback as well. Just because there's no community scale option here doesn't mean that we've forgotten about this geography of the study area. It's just that it wouldn't make any sense to look at a community scale solution given the very low density of development along the lake. What we did do, though, with the graphic on the right-hand side is provide, and this is not in the report, something we just put together, and just to give people some sense, though, of what we're thinking when we talk about taking an approach where you're relocating buildings. So the graphic here on the right, on Oco Line, there's a series of homes, larger lots where the bluff is actually getting quite close to some of these homes as we speak, and updated mapping would tell us even more about that. And so one of these options where you're looking ahead and want to move back would be seeing if you could work with the owner of these agricultural parcels and realign the road further to the northwest and move those buildings back when they become threatened by erosion. So I just wanted to throw that one out there because it's not that we've forgotten about this geography at all. We just didn't come up with a community scale approach. So I wanted to throw that out there. Okay. So moving out of the high bluffs now, we're into Region 2A. So Region 2A, we Erie Beach, and there's a photograph on the right-hand side of the screen. Fairly continuous shoreline protection along this stretch. One of the things that differentiates Erie Beach from its neighbor, Erie Shore Drive, is that the lands are generally a fair bit higher. And so they're less flood prone than the neighboring homes that are on Erie Shore Drive. So they're less risk there as well. And so with the Erie Beach stretch, we came up with, again, a series of our options, alpha options. Option C, maintaining existing shore protection. So near continuous protection, it needs to be maintained in the future. Where needed, new shore protection should be constructed. And there are a couple low spots in the eastern portion where foundations and grades could be raised to deal with flooding, but it's not as dramatic as it is in some of the other places. Okay, so that's Erie Beach, and on to Erie Shore Drive. And there's a lot of comments on Erie Shore Drive, and so I will take you through those as well as explaining the options here. So I think one of the things to mention here, and I think it should be pretty obvious for those that have a chance to go through the report, we came up with many different concepts here to try to find different options. So there, I think it's 6 in total that we looked at. And so I'm going to walk you through them all. There is still some unknowns moving forward here, and we'll touch on that in a bit. They are not ranked by us in any type of way. So we're presenting a total of 6 different options here. Some of them would need to be combined together, and more information is needed. And I'll touch on that in a few slides here before I think there's a decision ultimately that will be made by the community, by the council, and by the staff moving forward. But I'll take you through these different options. So first of all, option 2-1A. So here, left-hand side, we have a rock revetment. So this is a sloping structure, 2 stones thick. We factored in the impacts of climate change on the crest of the structure, which makes it a very high elevation. And you can see it schematically here that the top of the rock structure to count for that future impact of climate change on the water levels is essentially at the roof line of the cottages. So this is a massive structure. To put in context, it would look something similar to what we see in the lower right-hand corner here, which is a sloping rock structure at the Pickering nuclear plant. So just to put in context what this structure would look like. It could be built, but it comes at a very large price tag at $59 to $84 million. One of the questions that came in was, if you do this rock structure, do you still need to fix the dike and the road to the north? So, and the answer is yes, you still need to make the necessary repairs to the dike itself and reopen the road. And that is the concept that is on the screen next. And I think from Tim and Thomas's group have put this together. And just to walk you through it a bit, the lake is on the left-hand side of this schematic. The area here is the current Erie Shore Drive right away, and the current slope is the dashed red line. So this is what the drainage ditch looks like now, and then it raises up to the agricultural area. And so the concept that is included in 2-1A is building this new cross section, the blue dash line, essentially twinning the dike and building a new structure to the north on the agricultural lands, and then building another drainage scheme here for the fields to drain appropriately. There are other components here. The pink or the magenta color includes some drainage for the properties as well. So if water does make it over the structures, but also just generally rainfall as well, there has to be a way to convey that water away. And this concept for this dike includes, again, proper catch basins and a drainage system so that water could be collected and ensure that the road is accessible. So those are 2 components. The sloping rock structure on the left there, as well as a reconstructed dike. And when you add those two together to have a robust design that is going to work for you well into the future, we're calling this a 50-year planning horizon. That's $59 to $84 million. All right, so then we went back to the drawing board a bit and said, well, what else can we do? And we said, let's design this structure and not factor in the impacts of climate change. I'm not suggesting that's something you should do, but as a sensitivity analysis, what if we assume that the lake will not get higher than it did last summer and do the design again? And so we've done that with this option, 2-1B. We're calling this a 25-year planning horizon. It's still a robust structure that's going to be keyed into the lake. So you're excavating out the lake portion here, 2-layer structure, has a crest that's about 1 meter lower than the previous design. and will provide certainly long-term protection here. The cost to do this over the 3.3 kilometers is on the order of 46 to 64 million. So still a very significant cost moving forward. And as I mentioned just previously, you still need to fix the dike. So this work to build a new dike to the north, new drainage system for the agricultural fields, as well as drainage for the residences along Erie Shore Drive is also still included. Okay. And then we did one more iteration. And if we just go back, you can see that on the sketch here, we have 2 layers of large stones. These are quarried armor stones. They're very large, 2 to 4 tons. This next design is it's essentially a hybrid approach where you use a different geometry with the rock, and you use a broader gradation or size range. And so they're purposely not drawn all the same size here. You have big rocks and slightly smaller rocks, and you're building it with a double bench sequence. So you have a bench out here, and then it slopes up, and then you have a crest as well. And so this is something that is done in locations where they have an access to a broader range of material, and you can often get the rock at a slightly cheaper cost than buying only the biggest rock from the quarry. It also gives you more flexibility when you build the structure because you don't have to place each rock individually, but it doesn't last as long. And so that's why we're calling this the 20-year rock berm. And this structure, to build it across the entire stretch of Erie Shore Drive, is on the order of 37 to 50 million. Again, you still need to fix the dike, build a new dike, landward of the current structure, so that's included as well. All right, I'm just going to check my questions here. Okay, so those are the protect options. This next one is certainly one where we don't have all the information, and so option that we need to really detail this. And so option 2-2 is what we're calling retreat. There's 2 components that could potentially be part of this option. One of them would be a buyout program if there is such a program available through senior levels of government. And at this time, we don't have such a program. So I want to be clear here that we're talking about the hypotheticals here, in a sense, that you could move forward this option if the government was to make a program available where there could be a buyout from willing sellers. The other option, again, with this would be to relocate homes away from the hazards. So as we're showing here with the trucks and moving structures, it can be done. It's not easy. It's not convenient in some cases, but in some cases, it might make sense as well. And so we don't know how many people might prefer to have a buyout program versus want to relocate their home. So a lot of uncertainties from our perspective on this concept that make it hard to really nail down a firm approach. But from a high level, moving back from the coast is definitely something that you could do here with option 2-2. If certain things were to come in place. So as far as how much would it cost to do something like this, again, we don't know how many people would prefer to move or have a buyout program, so very difficult. The assessed value of these properties in 2019 along Erie Shore Drive was roughly $20 million. So next, I'm going to go to option 2-3. But before I do, I want to just go back just to reiterate, this is not a standalone option. If it was even to become materialized and accepted and implemented, because if you are to remove all the homes or relocate them to safe location, you still have to protect the dike. The dike still needs to be protected from erosion. It still needs to provide protection to the agricultural lands. And so option 2-3 is an approach to Erie Shore Drive where option 2.2 is executed. Again, we don't have all the details yet how that would happen, but it would follow 2-2 where the dike is upgraded so that it provides protection for the agricultural lands. And so as we show in the top right-hand corner here, the road, Bisnet Line and Erie Road become your east-west artery. If you're in Erie Beach, for example, the green strip along the lake here is suggesting that this becomes a natural area. The dike itself could be vegetated, but you also still need to have rock protection along the shoreline because it's still eroding. It's been eroding for a long time. And so what we've done with this cross section on the left-hand side, it's a hybrid or a modified version of this rock berm. It would be okay for waves to go over top, so the crest is lower because you don't have homes or a road behind it. And then you could renaturalize that green strip and make sure that the area was safe and water could flow up and flow back as it would along a natural beach system. There's also would still need to be efforts to raise the elevation of the current dike. And so this concept here with the purple trapezoid, essentially suggesting that on top of the footprint of the current dike, there would be efforts to raise it and stabilize it to a new higher elevation so that it's going to provide the appropriate protection for the flooding of the interior lands. And so with this option here, the two of them added together, again, recognizing that there's uncertainties on what 2-2 would cost, somewhere in the order of $42 to $52 million. All right, and then the last option that we came up with for Erie Shore Drive is 2-4. And we've explained this in the past, calling this a transformative adaptation approach because it looks essentially to realign the land uses. So you're transforming the landscape with this last option and using nature to protect or stabilize the area. And so just walking everyone through the options here, this would include the purchase of both the waterfront lots along the lake, the area that was green and it would be naturalized, as well as all of the interior agricultural lands to the east of Bisnet Line to the south of Erie Road. And the area is essentially a return to nature, back to a coastal wetland, which is what it was 100 years ago. It would feature some open water elements. It would have shallow meadow areas as well. And then this area that's labeled upland would be higher wooded areas. And they would be especially high along Erie Road so that you would build an upland forest essentially that's going to protect Erie Road from flooding. And so that, again, you're using nature to create that buffer and make sure that you have safe ingress and egress to the community of Erie. And so, again, this option would be combined with 2-2 plus the purchase of the agricultural land and then the renaturalization of this and sort of reimagining this area, what it could be, and reverting back to nature. And the cost to do all that, the estimate is the 53 to 67 million. Okay, so I have some questions that I'm going to just comment on quickly, but importantly, so that people can have some answers. So there was a question that came in that's asked specifically from a coastal engineering perspective, what would we recommend for getting long-term nature of it? And so, as I mentioned at the onset here, I think it's pretty clear, hopefully for everyone, that we put a lot of effort into coming up with a range of different options here. We don't have all the information that we need really to come up with a firm recommendation. And ultimately, we feel firmly that this decision will rest with the council and the staff and the members of the community. So we're not quite in a position to say, this is what we would recommend from a science or an engineering perspective, because I think we need more information to understand what the landowners and the community want for this area moving forward. The one thing, though, that I will highlight is that the severity of the risk here is very high. And so I just want to really emphasize that. And that's why we put really some extra effort into this geography, because it's vulnerable now. Obviously, we know what's happened with the road and the emergency dike repairs. And the best science that we have tells us that lake levels are going to go higher in the future. And so I would really encourage everyone to take a very long-term perspective here and think about moving forward. What is the right decision for this community and for all of the landowners involved? But also thinking about what I've highlighted several times is that maintenance is always required and will always be required in an area like this moving forward, unless you go back to nature, which is what the option on the screen is, because if you go back to nature, then you can build resilience through the natural ecosystem. Okay, now, okay, so I'm going to keep going. Okay, I'm going to backtrack on that. There's a couple more comments that came in. Was raised by someone that the cost to protect Erie Shore Drive in the last several decades has been the burden of the private landowners along the lake. Moving forward, it was recommended that a more holistic view be taken and that those costs be shared by all that benefit from taking an action on Erie Shore Drive. And I would echo that. And one of the things that we've written in the report is that one of the options that could be taken moving forward is to work with a drainage engineer and use the Drainage Act to look at these various options that we've developed, further advance them where they need to be, and then allocate those costs to all of the benefiting parties to further understand what the cost implications would be. Okay, so I'm going to move back to the slides. Moving on to Region 3A, so the village of Erie. And we'll start here with the road, Erie Road, that transitions into Ross Lane and Mariner in front of the church, St. Anne's Church, an area that's been a longstanding area with flood risk and vulnerability. And there was recently some repairs. So the image on the, on the lower right-hand corner is the cross section that's been recently upgraded with by raising up the elevation and placing some rock in front of it. And so what we've done with option 3-2 here is recognize that this is your only route in and out of Erie, as everyone knows, and it needs to be accessible at all times, including during storm events. And so the concept that we came up with was option 3-2, which is a formal rock revetment section that you can see in the white area here. Again, 2 layers of rock dug into the bottom of the lake, so that it provides you with that long-term protection. This would be a 50-year planning horizon structure. So that was the recommendation there, and we got some good feedback, and I've heard this from a few parties now, including the Conservation Authority, that the beach itself moving into the village has been eroding well past the area that we're sort of showing here. And so there was some feedback that just came in today suggesting that this concept needs to move on the order of couple hundred meters further to the east, because the beach is eroded during these high water levels back to some of the properties as well. So we appreciate that feedback and hearing from people about what's happening currently. All right, so onto the village of Erie then itself, and we've again identified a series of options here, from looking at higher regulatory standards, updating shoreline protection, which is option C, in some cases raising foundations and grades where we have low-lying areas, upgraded private septic systems. This was also a comment that came in that while we touch on that a bit, we didn't go into great lengths on this issue, and that's not to suggest it's not an important issue. Functioning private sector systems are very, very important. One of our challenges is we don't know what everybody has below the ground. So we haven't really been able to delve into this at this level of planning study, but definitely something that is important moving forward. Raising road elevations. So there's a series of things that could be done on a lot by lot basis where you have the highest vulnerability. But what we've also done here is recommend in the medium term, and that would be in a 5 to 10 years, that there needs to be additional planning done for this community, recognizing how low-lying it is. And if we think back to the vulnerability assessment, the number of buildings, primary and secondary buildings, impacted during the 100-year lake level, when you factor in that additional half meter of climate change, jumps up to on the order of 400 buildings. So this is an area that has very low vulnerability to these higher lake levels that are being projected in the future by Environment Canada. All right, Region 3B, the communities of Rondo Bay itself, so moving into Shrewsbury and the other areas on the fringing on the inside. Again, we have come up with a whole range of options there from A to J, and they include dealing with road elevations, building foundations, septic systems, etc. Can walk through those, but also in a medium term, so not necessarily on your short term 0 to 5 years, but moving forward, there definitely needs to be some more planning done to look at these vulnerabilities across these communities and make sure that you're not only in a good position for the historical range of water levels, but starting to build resilience so that you can be viable, healthy, safe communities during lake levels that are even higher than what we saw in 2019. Okay, so we're getting close now. I'm just going to check if we have any questions that I missed. Okay, so Region 4, so the Federal Navigation Channel and the Rondo Barrier. So I showed some slides here of how it's changed. This is an area that is incredibly vulnerable and one where we really need everybody to come together and participate in a solution. And the option that we've come up with here, 4-3, which is a barrier beach restoration. It's a 2-part plan. The first part includes reconnecting this east jetty that now just sits out in the lake back to the end of the sand spit here, Seagull Island, as it's referred to locally. So this is a structural intervention where this is reattached so that the waves can't make it through this gap anymore and cause sedimentation problems in the navigation channel. The backside in the channel itself, there's a lot of sediment that's accumulated there that could be then dug out and put back to where it once was on the beach here. And that would be done hydraulically with a dredge. And the graphic, the schematic here is showing you a small portable dredge that would be ideally suited for this kind of application. It has a hydraulic arm that goes down into the lake bottom here, much like a snowblower, and it sucks up the sand and pumps it over to where you want the sand to go. And there's one that's being used in Cobourg now that's actually owned by the municipality of Cobourg quite successfully. So the sand's being dug up on the backside to create a new beach out in the front here and stabilizing this area. And then phase 2 would be working further to the east and stabilizing this entire barrier system. There'd be a combination of a buried rock structure here at the back of the beach, which is the gray line. And then again, sand being placed on the beach, a new dune being constructed, new habitat being built there to stabilize it with the sand that would be excavated or dug up off of the beach on the west side of the West Jetty. And so as I talked about in the first half of the presentation, all this sand is naturally accumulating on the beach here, and its rightful place is over to the east. And so this plan would include mechanically moving that sand to where it's needed most to rebuild the resilience of this barrier beach structure. And then a whole host of benefits that could could happen in the future. And this could become both an area for people with a new beach feature, but also a tremendous opportunity to recreate habitat here as well. So that's option 4-3, $10 to $15 million. So not a cheap option again, but encourage everyone to work to make sure that doesn't happen, because that would be a real disaster for this area. The last thing I want to mention here on this one, with this additional provincial funding that we received, we've been given a mandate from the province to work with partners to build up a community group of stakeholders here to try to pursue an option for this stretch of shoreline as well. So we're looking forward to moving forward with those that want to participate willingly in a study to collaborate on this option, because there are so many different landowners and stakeholders to try to pursue a solution and look for some funding opportunities as well. So I think on to the last slide here. So some next steps, which we've outlined both in the report and in the executive summary. And so at the top of the list, we have prioritizing the most vulnerable regions and proceeding with the planning and engineering studies that are required. We've listed them here: Erie Shore Drive, protecting the dike along Erie Road, opposite of St. Anne's Church. There's been some work done there already. Finishing the EA for the Talbot Trail west of Erie Beach. Again, completing the EA for Rose Beach Line and moving forward there, as well as the Region 4 there, protecting the navigation channel and restoring the Rondo Barrier Beach. So those are the 5 areas of greatest risk that we've identified. We also have, moving down here, reaching a consensus on the remaining regions. Just because you're not in those top 5 areas doesn't mean that you don't have challenges. And so there needs to be some decisions and further planning studies in some of those second tier locations. There will be some work that the Conservation Authority may choose to pursue once they have the technical information from this study. And then there also may be plans that the municipality wants to take forward when they update their official plan based on the technical findings of this study. And so with that, Your Worship, and Madam Clerk, I'm done with my slides and happy to take any questions.
Councillor Latimer.
Thank you, through the mayor. Peter, once again, thank you very, very much for clarification of what your recommendations are and why you are recommending the priority order the way you are. I see you prioritizing Region 2B, Erie Shore Drive is first. I also understand you're recommending that we use the Drainage Act to further understand the cost implications of each of these 6 options you've provided. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Already, great. And that takes us right back to the community where I think we've all agreed we'll be going, because to go forward with the Drainage Act, that does put it back, allows the property owners there to have full participation in whatever occurs through that act. So I'll leave that at that. The other question I have is, I'm assuming too that for option 2-4, where we are using nature to protect and stabilize that area, that the maintenance of that area would be 1%, like all the other options. Is that correct? Like a yearly 1% of the actual cost?
So that's a great question. I think, and I'm going to give a bit of a loose answer here because I just can't give you definitive detail, but by returning that area to nature, and you're still putting some rock along the old dike and naturalizing that, the maintenance would be significantly less than maintaining the status quo land uses, for example, because it's okay for waves to run over the current dike when it becomes a natural barrier system, because that's what happens in nature. And so I would not go so far as to say there'd be no maintenance with that naturalization option. We are always working in our natural areas, whether it's provincial areas or our national parks, but the maintenance would be less than some of the options that are more the structured engineering approaches to maintain current land uses.
Thank you for confirming that. So I was actually speaking to Councillor Thompson and Councillor Sakati about this, and I don't know why I was surprised, but the cost to go through for 21A, where we put in the 50-year armor stone revetment, is the very same cost that we would have to do the 2.4. And that would include that buyout of the property owners. But the difference in costs, the long-standing difference, would be just that maintenance, ongoing maintenance cost, correct?
Yes, that's correct. It's the idea with this, working with nature-based approach is that you've reduced the risk to assets like structures, roads, and dikes, and that, and you're building your resilience with nature. So you in essence, if it was desirable, you can return this area to nature, because at one point it was a wetland. If everyone recalls the map I showed in the first half of the presentation, and then you rely on nature to preserve it. And the part that we haven't touched on at all, well, two parts. Again, and I can't stress enough that these are ideas. I feel like our job here is to lay out the range of ideas for this community to consider. One, you have the potential for tourism opportunities to develop, because you've created a very large natural area, much like Point Pelee National Park, for example, where birding is a major issue and a popular destination. But if you recall too, in the very northwest corner, there's a portion where the lands are above the 100-year lake level. And so we didn't really want to go down the road very far with that, because I think it's premature, but maybe there's an option to make a people place somewhere in that concept as well, where there are lands for people to live on that are safe and above the 100-year flood level, and they're still close to the current lands along Erie Shore Drive.
Thank you very much. Again, I think your answer very much points us in the direction of where we thought we were going in the first place, and that is looking for the current landowner's direction. And as I said, through the Drainage Act, to further understand all the cost implications of each of these 6 options. Thank you again, Peter, very, very much for your presentation tonight. That's it.
You're welcome.
Councillor Wright, followed by Councillor Oche.
Thank you, Mayor. To you, Peter. I have some questions. We really haven't talked on the Rose Beach line here tonight, where the road is gone, it's closed off, and the 3 homes that are behind the road have no access to the road now. You talk about a 30-foot slide. A 30-foot slide there would have the whole road in the lake, and the sewer pipe and the water line would be all gone. But the 3 residents there have no options but to leave. There's been nothing said, nothing done. They can't put armor rock across the road. There's really has been no options for them there.
Mm-hmm.
Have you looked at that?
Yes. So thank you for the question. And the recommended option there for Rose Beach line is to realign the road up to New Scotland Line, as mentioned. But that planning was not done lightly, and the sketch, which we could bring up if you like, it did include the construction of new arteries behind those homes to provide them access to some of the existing north-south routes. So with that concept, everyone had a route to get them to the north and up to New Scotland Line. So no one was being left without a viable access route, and those costs were factored into to that concept.
Okay, apparently like the land across from the the road on the lakeside is privately owned, so they can't put no stone or nothing in there. So it's really leaving them with no options here. Yeah.
Yeah. I think where that needs to go next is now we've done this detailed deep dive into the impacts of climate change and understanding the current risks. And I think it's now time for that EA, that environmental assessment that was started, to kind of pick up with this new technical information that we've been able to generate and continue to go through that planning exercise and finish off that environmental assessment and come up with the right approach and make sure that everybody is properly treated.
Yeah, because without a road access, it's pretty hard to get to your house. They're now driving from lawn to lawn to lawn to get out. That's the only option they have right now.
Mm-hmm.
Should be looked at.
Okay.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for the feedback.
Councillor Oche, followed by Councillor Harrigan.
Thank you, through you, Your Worship. Peter, I noticed in this study there was nothing to do with any jetties. Could you explain to everyone why that is?
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, great. No rock jetties or shore perpendicular structures. There's a section in the report dedicated to that that reviews some of the options that we considered, but ultimately didn't select to include in the protect options where you're using the engineered approaches. And there's quite a few reasons for that. The first being at the highest level, rock groins or steel sheet pile groins, structures that are shore perpendicular into the lake to trap sand. I think it's important for everyone to know that they were never conceived to be a viable erosion mitigation approach along eroding shorelines. They were developed along ocean coastlines that are sand environments. And one of the reasons that they are not effective in the long term along the stretch of Chatham-Kent shoreline is there's two reasons, for sure, at least two. One, there's not a lot of sand. So you have a clay shoreline, you don't have a sand shoreline. And the other is that earlier when I was talking about the lake bottom eroding during storm events, those structures are somewhere in the order of 20 or 30 feet long in most cases. The erosion is happening 500-600 meters offshore. And so you're only dealing with a very minute, small portion of that erosion process right next to the shoreline. So they're not effective in the long term. The other reason that we don't like them in these type of eroding shorelines is that the sand can empty out. So I wouldn't for a minute say that they don't trap some sand in some of the locations along the shoreline, because they certainly do. But they also can quickly lose their sand when the storms come from a different direction, for example. And so when you most need them, which is during the current high lake phase that we have right now, a lot of cases the groin fields are not that full, or they're emptied out because the high water has sucked out that sand and put it out into the shallow waters. And so when you really need them, which is right now during high lake levels, they're not functional. So those are some of the reasons. There's more details in the report. We certainly looked at it. We've received a fair bit of comment on them from different people throughout the study. And we did look at them, but when it comes to permanence and durability and successfully protecting property, we think that these rock structures that we've designed conceptually for this study are a better approach.
Thank you. Through you, Your Worship. Also with the jetties, is it true that, say you had 6 of them, I don't know, in 200 feet or whatever, it causes problems down farther, so your soil or your bank is still going to stay, but then it starts to chew in the bank, into the bank farther down where there is none?
Yes, that's exactly right. And it's, again, there was a graphic in the report that touched on that. And so, again, during low water levels and maybe even average water levels, they can have some benefit. But what they typically do on the edge, wherever they stop, they do end up causing negative impacts to the adjacent properties. So it's for that reason that the permitting agencies that need to comment on them, including the conservation authorities, have to be very careful about where they would even consider them, because they are definitely been shown, and this has been proven in court, to cause negative impacts to adjacent properties.
And that's kind of what's happening at Erie at the harbor, correct?
That's what's happening, yes, to the east of the navigation channel at a very large scale, is that you've been very successful at trapping sand on the main beach in Erie, and you've been very successful at starving the tip of the provincial park. And so, yes, it's that balance. And when we've talked about this a fair bit in the public meetings, the importance of scale and understanding impacts both to your immediate area of interest, but also taking that broader perspective of looking at the entire shoreline and making sure you're not causing negative impacts somewhere else.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Councillor Harrigan, followed by Councillor Sakachi.
Hi, thank you. Through the mayor, I have a few questions. Most of them are related to Area 1B, the High Bluffs. The first question is, you spoke about a community approach versus individual, lots or individual homeowner approaches from a both data consolidation perspective and then also in your recommendations. That being said, is there an opportunity when the final report is provided, which I'm assuming would include kind of some of those data summaries, for homeowners to access data that's specific to their location?
Yeah, I think the answer is yes. I think information that's generated, technical information for this study, should be available to anyone that wants it, with the precaution that we weren't generating information specifically for their lot, but I would have no concerns about sharing information to anyone that would want it. We've already shared some information to some of the private landowners that asked.
Okay, thank you. And then in terms of the costs within the report, and I might have missed this, I know that you had identified the estimate of the cost with a range around, includes property value, but not contents. Specifically around the High Bluff area, did you look at what the cost of like land erosion would be? Some of the farmers out there, they'll farm right up almost to the very edge of the bluff.
Mm-hmm. Yes, so we, I guess I might ask you a question, because I'm not sure what you mean by land erosion. I guess, could you elaborate?
Yep, so there was the photo that you provided had kind of the erosion rate on Talbot Trail, and how basically like we can expect the erosion to basically go past the road to disappear. And so when we're relocating that, the recommendation to retreat, I'm just wondering about like the cost. So there's businesses along Talbot Trail, there's farmland around Talbot Trail, there's vacant lots around Talbot Trail, in addition to buildings. But it seems like the report is really just focused on the buildings in terms of giving that like estimation for cost.
Right, okay, I understand, thank you. So I think you're correct. The report, we focused on the impacted buildings, primary and secondary buildings, as well as the length of road that would be impacted by erosion if nothing is done. And then to look for the options, we've factored in for this retreat option, which is realigning the road. We've factored in moving all of the buildings, on the order of 500 buildings, and moving them inland. So the cost to pick them up and move them, the cost to purchase a new place to put them, and also the cost to construct a new alignment for the road. So we have not added the cost of the land that's eroded, I guess.
Okay. And I'm sorry, this is a bit of a kind of basic question, but in the reference that you provided where there was a road realignment, like, is this pragmatically, this happens where they move houses so some level of government would pay for the cost of moving the house, or is that something that's borne by individual property owners?
Yeah, that's a great question. There is some examples in Chatham-Kent that the Conservation Authority was able to provide where buildings have been moved along the bluffs in the past. And I think the important thing to note then was there was a current standing program at the provincial level where the landowners could apply and receive the funds to help pay for this relocation. And so it speaks to the real value of having these types of standing programs, which we currently don't have any at the federal provincial level. So it's happened in the past. The road that was realigned near Port Bruce was a decision that was made municipally that the road was too close to the bluff. It was not feasible to try to protect the bluff. And so they went through environmental assessment and found a new alignment further inland for the road. So it has happened just down the lake from Chatham-Kent, and it's something that's at sort of a higher level happening all over the world. And I realize we're talking about Chatham-Kent tonight, but there are active conversations all over the world about not being able to save all of our roads in response to sea level rise and erosion. And one of the more famous ones is the road to the tip of the Florida Keys and Key West. And they've come to done some studies there suggesting that it may not be a road all the way to Key West anymore because they can't afford to protect them. So it's a very difficult decision. As I should really say, all of these decisions are very difficult and they're affecting people in different ways. So I want to just reemphasize that these are important decisions affecting people's assets and the place they live. So they're all very difficult decisions, but it is something that we're seeing more and more all over the world.
Right. Thank you. Thank you so much for your information. The remainder of the questions I have, I believe, are to CK administration. So I'll hold them until we get to that item on the agenda.
You're welcome.
Councillor Sakachi, followed by Councillor Pinsino.
Through your worship to Mr. Zuzak. So most of my questions regarding 2B is going to be to administration. But the one question I did have for you, Mr. Zuzak, is that we're talking about the one item that's really concerning to me is the barrier beach, because obviously that has huge impact on multiple areas of our community, and because of future, past stances regarding provincial lands and naturalization and how they kind of let things take their course. In your opinion, because you've been through a lot of these projects, what is the best way to advocate that something needs to be done to that area, so we can protect it and mitigate the challenges that we are seeing? Because obviously it's beyond our control. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on the best way that we can kind of advocate for us to be able to do something there, or for somebody to do something there. Sorry.
Right. Okay, that's a great question, Councillor. I think the first step is collaboration. And so this is an area, this geography that has multiple landowners and stakeholders. And the first important step is to bring that group together and have regular conversations. And so that's, as I highlighted, one of the things that this additional funding from the province will allow us to do over the next 10 or 11 months is to build a collaboration that to include, for example, the municipality, the Conservation Authority, the provincial park staff, Ontario Parks. It's a federal navigation channel. You have small craft harbor interests there. You have fisheries with Department of Fisheries and Oceans. You have the wetlands that both provincially and federally are cared for by Environment Canada and Ministry of Natural Resources. You have all of the landowners, places like Shrewsbury and the marina operation, the commercial fishing fleet. So we have a multitude of people that rely on that functioning navigation channel. You have all the creatures I mentioned, like the spotted gar, long-nosed gar, and the Fowler's toad, endangered species that are about to be wiped off the face of this planet if we don't care for them. You need to get everyone together and have courageous conversations. And so that's one of the first steps we're going to take. The next step that I hope we can take as a group for those that want to participate in this discussion is to show how there can be multiple benefits, or I like to call co-benefits, to moving forward. So the status quo approach of, we'll call it do nothing, is not good for the habitat in the park. It's not good for the federal navigation channel. It's not good for recreational boating. It's really not good for a lot of things. And so we have to create a plan, and the sketches that we have are just the start that I showed tonight, where we can reimagine, re-envision this area, restore it back to what it used to be, and then manage and protect it in a way that it's going to provide the necessary function to protect that bay, to make sure you have a safe navigation channel, to make sure the communities in the bay themselves are protected from lakeways, and show, though, the people that might be potential funders that you can create significant ecological benefits as well. So it's that concept of working with nature, restoring habitat that would be beneficial for endangered species, for example. So it's that whole spectrum of co-benefits that we need to chase and show that we can do something here that's good for everyone and all species, etc. And organize. I think the last point is we're not aware of a program right now that might be able to provide funding for any of these geographies, but you have to be prepared. You have to be organized. You need to have people willing to collaborate across all levels of government, and you need to have a plan. And so that's what we're advocating for Region 4, and we hope that whoever wants to participate are going to jump on board and help us move that forward.
I greatly appreciate the thoroughness of your answer. That really does help. And I guess the last just little follow-up question I have is, are you aware of any, because it's kind of unique where kind of that portion sits, being provincially, as a park, as well as, Erie, Rondo Bay, as well as Lake Erie. Are you aware of any other kind of pieces that have that kind of functioning and that many different kind of co-benefits as you speak of, that's had a similar uptaking of a project like this? Potentially?
Yeah, so there's a great example which we could share through the municipality website or the Let's Talk Chatham-Kent. The place is called Braddock's Bay on Lake Ontario. It's in New York State. It's an area that we worked on through one of the IJC studies almost 20 years ago, but the beach disappeared. And much like it has the barrier beach at Rondo to this bay called Braddock's Bay, and the Army Corps of Engineers came together with the state government and the community, and they built the beach. They put it back, and now it's a sheltered embayment again. They've been working on restoring the wetlands and enhancing the habitat in the bay, and already in a couple of years seen enormous benefits. By putting the beach back, they're able to restore the dune ecosystem that's important for migratory birds and endangered species like piping plover. So all kinds of exciting things that can be done, as well as creating a people place too, having a place for boats to be able to pull up and enjoy the summer weather. So that's a really good case study where they've done a fairly similar project, and it's been very successful, and it's weathered the last couple of years of high lake levels. The project's still there and doing well.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to reiterate, like, my concern, you know, for the village of Shrewsbury and all that as well, because if that erodes further, seeing, you know, what the water height is now, if those lake, you know, waves are generated through there, is just really concerning. So I really hope that this is a project that all the co-partners can step up together, and maybe we can have it. And I'd love for you to share that soon, because I'd love to read about that a little bit. So thank you for your time. That's all for me.
You're welcome.
Councillor Pinsonneau, followed by Councillor Thompson.
Thank you, Your Worship. Through you to Peter. Going back to Rosa Beach line, I gather from your answers to Councillor Wright that there won't be a lot of progress on this road until the EA is completed. Is that correct?
Well, I think, you know, I think our job with this study was to look at options and to cost them and make sure they're long-term and viable. And that's, you know, we're done that for the most part now. We need to get everyone's feedback tonight and then finalize our document. And I think the next step, and staff would probably be better suited to speak to this, but the next step is to reinitiate that environmental assessment and move forward through that process to ultimately select the solution and the path forward.
Okay, yeah, and I totally understand that. I know this was because they, you know, it was a couple of years ago they started having problems, maybe even longer than that. And so this has been one of the ones that's been on the books the longest, probably, of all of Chatham-Kent's lakefront. Do you know what the estimated time to finish this is going to be? So that, because I guess, like Councillor Wright said, they're driving across each other's front yards to get out, and they're one slide away from not having any access to the properties. So at some point, this one's got to be moved along as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate the urgency, and I've spoken to some of the landowners on the phone as well in that very geography. So I've been there many times myself. So it's in the list of your most vulnerable regions for a reason. Sorry, and as far as reinitiating the EA though, and where that's at, I just don't know the answer to that. So, but I'm sure staff at the appropriate time tonight can answer that question.
Mr. Mayor, it's Thomas. I can answer that. So the EA is about, I'd say 80% completed. And we were just waiting for these results from the Zuzak study to complete. So it's one of our recommendations tonight. And if council agree with those recommendations, we'll initiate that immediately. We hope to be wrapping that up within, you know, by the summer type thing once everything is completed. And then we'll be coming back to council with a report on our best recommend for that area.
Okay, that's good, Thomas. Just out of curiosity, do you foresee that as being a private road for these property owners when we do get to that point, or is it going to be some sort of a public access route through there?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's difficult to say at this time. I really need to go through complete the EA process, I would say, before I'd make that recommendation.
Okay, sorry to put you on the spot. Yeah, I just wanted to reiterate the urgency here. Like even Peter said, he's been out there. We're one slide away from these people being stranded. So, all right, thank you.
Okay, Councillor Thompson's the last one I see that's hasn't asked questions before. I see Councillor Latimer is looking for one more. If anyone else does have questions, I'll make this a last call for questions. I recognize the last two. If anybody pops in the next little while, we'll recognize them as well. Go ahead, Councillor Thompson.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. Peter, looking at all of the costs in regards to your options, pretty much up and down the Lake Erie shoreline, but the renaturalization option most specifically, that didn't include the potential loss of tax revenue, did it?
No, we didn't do that sort of multi-year planning, nor did we look at the potential for economic benefits through enhanced tourism. So no, we didn't.
No, that's fair. Just something that we need to be aware of.
Yes.
Had a couple of questions in regards to coming through on my my messenger actually. For the Erie Shore Drive, why would we need a dike if the revetments were put in place?
You need a dike because that slope is unstable. You still have rainwater hitting it. You still have drainage from all of the private properties that has to go somewhere. So that structure, it's a dual multi-purpose feature, and it's not only the lake ways itself, but the overall structural integrity of it, having it function as a road, and being a safe buffer from erosion as well. So it is unfortunately both, not one or the other.
All right, and I imagine that would be the same reason. I think I saw there the revetments would actually be higher than the dike. I mean, if we were to put those revetments in on Erie Shore Drive.
Yeah, so it's a great question. On the crest of the dikes, they are designed in a way to ensure that the water flowing over them during a storm, and I think we've all seen footage and video and pictures of what that looks like now. They have to be designed in such a way that the amount of water overtopping across the crest is minimized so that the structural integrity of the crest itself is not compromised. And that goes hand in hand as well of reducing the risk of that water impacting buildings behind it and the road and the dike. And so the reason that the option 2-1A is so high is that option is factoring in the projected higher lake levels due to climate change. And so that's very high structure. So that's how that is done in the proper engineering design investigation, is to go through an iterative process with your engineering calculations to make sure that you have a height that can be stable, because the water flowing over the top, as it does now in some locations, is very destructive, and you have to make sure that doesn't happen.
Excellent. My final question before I hand it back would be, with the costings that are brought up, did that include underground infrastructure like municipal water lines?
In most cases, there's line items there, either individual line items or contingency that would deal with removing a water line, for example, or underground utilities. So yes, it's either addressed specifically or in the contingency that's added to the pricing.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Those are all my questions.
You're welcome.
Okay, seeing the last two questioners would be Councillor Latimer, and then the last would be Councillor OJ.
Thank you, through you. I think my next question would be more directed towards our administration, but I wondered if you needed a motion to accept this report.
No, we don't need a motion.
Very good. Thank you.
Councillor OJ.
Thank you, Worship. Just one more question. Considering Erie Beach, if we were to do the more dike work and into the property of the farms, not the naturalization, but keeping the houses where they are and everything, why could the residents not move back into their homes while that's going on?
Let me just ask a question, make sure I understand. So you're talking about doing one of the protection options for Erie Shore Drive that would include one of the rock options along the lake, plus upgrading the dike. Is that correct?
Yes, correct. Sorry, the one that I believe maybe Thomas had made. I know we saw it at a council meeting one night.
Right. So yeah, in general, they're the options 2-1A, 2-1 to C, so A, B, and C. Those options are essentially maintaining all the status quo land uses, They include building shoreline protection works on the lakeside with different planning horizons, as I mentioned, 50, 25, and 20. So essence, you do more maintenance, the cheaper the costs get. They all include also rebuilding the dike to the north, which will require the purchase of some agricultural lands, and then rebuilding the appropriate drainage for both the agricultural lands and then the drainage underneath the road. So that is the concept that, as you mentioned, Thomas's staff came up with. We've adopted it. So those approaches are two-phased, something at the lake and reconstructing the dike. Those are big construction projects. The logistics of being able to live on that road while those projects are underway is something that would have to be looked at. And I think I can't really give you a firm answer either way, but recognize that we're talking about major construction projects to bring all the rock to that site and also to realign the road. So
correct, and I do understand that, and I thank you for that. But I know there's close to 100 houses, and 90 some of them, the houses are empty at the moment, and the people are paying rent and leases elsewhere that I know would love to be back in their house anytime. So I just, like, if this is a 2-year project, what are they? And I know this is a hypothetical question because you can't answer it, but what are they to do for 2 years while this construction takes place?
yeah, I think I just want to reiterate that I fully understand the magnitude of the challenges there, and I feel for all those landowners. I think what happens next is what's up on the screen, which is establishing priorities, and then your staff can move forward with different options. So I think it's really outside of my realm here to comment too much on that, but I think
right,
it is critical to establish some priorities and move forward as a council, and then it's up to you guys.
Yeah, no, you've done a very good job, and that's kind of a hypothetical question. It's just we have to get answers to them, and I know maybe that should be maybe to Thomas or someone at Chatham-Kent, not yourself, Peter. But thank you very much for everything.
You're welcome.
Well, thank you, Mr. Zwick. That was a very comprehensive report, and you survived all the questions. We'll move on to item 9, deputations.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Council, this evening we have 3 deputations. The clerk's office will read all 3. We'll start with Meredith Kadot.
The first deputation is from Paul and Mary MacArthur. It says, to Mayor and Chatham-Kent Council members, good evening. We are Paul and Mary MacArthur. Our permanent residence is 12321 Rose Beach Line, recognized in Region 1D in the Lake Erie study, which is ground zero for road closure due to bank erosion. We have thoroughly read the long-awaited Lake Erie Shore study and want to remind Council that although we appreciate the crisis of Erie Shore Drive, we are also in urgent need of action. Although we are disappointed in the probability of keeping Rose Beach Line open along this stretch of road, which in our opinion is one of the most scenic drives, providing an unobstructed view of Lake Erie in southwestern Ontario, which should be considered a treasured asset to the municipality of Chatham-Kent. We realize the price tag of $26.7 million renders options 1-4 of Armourstone revetment unlikely. Therefore, we, along with Mrs. Knight, our neighbor, who due to the closure of the road in front of us is currently allowing temporary access to our property through her property, which is also at threat of future road closure due to erosion, fully endorse option 1-5, which is to decommission Rose Beach Line from McKinley Road to Wildwood, providing us connection to our homes through one of the proposed new access roads. Just to remind council, our homes are in no danger of falling into the lake. We do not have waterfront property. We live across the road from the lake. The issue is the municipal road, along with the water lines and Wildwood sewer line. We must have permanent access to our property and feel that option 1-5 satisfies this crisis issue. Thank you for your consideration. Paul and Mary MacArthur.
Next one by Kathy Hoffman. This next deputation is by Mr. Al DeJong. He says, my name is Al DeJong, and I am one of the owners of the properties on Erie Shore Drive. The Drainage Act keeps on coming up. What I understand is that this is a way for the municipality to retrieve money from the property owners. What has been done so far does not in any way help the property owners on Erie Shore Drive. Was the Drainage Act used to protect Erie O? What I understand is that we have two options. Option one is for the municipality to buy back all the properties from the property owners. If this is the route you choose to go, this buyback should be done at fair value, not necessarily tax assessed value. Just take a minute and look at the property assessment value for your home. Would you sell your home for that price? And if you buy back the properties, you would still have to put in shoreline protection in order to protect the dike, and you would lose all of the tax revenue. Option number two is to increase shoreline protection. I don't know exactly when the dike was built, but I understand that at some point the municipality installed a break wall and jetties in order to protect the dike. Through years of neglect by the municipality, the break wall and the jetties are not protecting the dike any longer in most areas. So many of the homeowners took it upon themselves to protect their homes with new break walls and jetties, which are in turn protecting the dike. You would almost think that homeowners should get reimbursed for protecting the dike. Yes, I understand that Chatham-Kent took over this area in amalgamation. I was of the understanding that if a municipality was taken over by another municipality by way of an amalgamation, that the infrastructure would be taken care of by the new municipality. For example, if a road was a paved road prior to amalgamation, it would stay a paved road after the amalgamation. Should this not apply here, in that if a municipality installs shoreline protection, it should maintain such shoreline protection? I would like to take this opportunity to thank Mayor Caniff and Town Council for all the time and effort you put into making Chatham-Kent a beautiful place to live. I'm pretty sure when you decided to run for office, you probably didn't realize how many lives you were about to change. This is the time for you, as leaders, to do the right thing and fix this problem once and for all. Thank you, the DeJong family.
Thank you. The last deputation is received by the Board of Directors, Erie Shore Drive Property Owners Association. Dear Honorable Mayor Caniff and members of council, we would like to acknowledge the municipality's continued commitment to working with the Erie Shore Drive Property Owner Association regarding a long-term solution for our unique stretch of shoreline. We are encouraged by the inclusion of the Drainage Act in Mr. Kelly's report, as we believe the Drainage Act provides a venue by which the financial burden of a long-term solution, inclusive of the dike and shoreline, can be shared equally between stakeholders who benefit. We would also like to acknowledge and thank Peter Zuzak for meeting with us to discuss our concerns and ideas and for making provisions for more realistic solutions in the final report. We have forwarded both reports to our experts and will be meeting with them and our membership in the coming weeks. We look forward to meeting with Chatham-Kent administration once we have received endorsement from our membership regarding next steps. Respectfully submitted. Those are all the deputations, Your Worship.
Okay, going to 10A, action from Chatham-Kent Lake Erie Shoreline Report. Councillor Harrigan.
Thank you. I would like to move the recommendations that are presented, and I would like to add recommendation number 6, that administration return to council with a report to identify opportunities and programs, human, information, or financial resource-based, that CK can make available to homeowners living in the most vulnerable areas along Lake Erie to protect and maintain their properties, given the long-term nature of the solutions outlined in the Zuzak report. These opportunities should be complementary and in addition to the recommendations listed above.
Councillor Sakachi, can I get a second on that?
I'll second that, Mayor Caniff, with number 6 included as well.
Sorry, back to Councillor Harrigan to discuss the amendment.
Great, thank you. So I just want to start by saying I really do appreciate all the work that's gone into the Zuzak report on the shoreline, but as I was reading it, I felt this level of discomfort that I was reading a very technical report, of which it should be. And, you know, when we're looking at options that include phrases like retreat and relocate buildings, we also need to think about what it is that the individuals who are occupying those buildings and what the community impacts are to some of the decisions that are coming forward. And I also know and have heard about the experiences from the residents of Erie Shore Drive. And then I look towards Talbot Trail with its temporary closure. And I worry that if we simply treat this as an engineering study or a coastal shoreline study, of which it is really the epitome of excellent research. But if we leave it there, then what we could find ourselves is in a position where very suddenly we need to take action in some of these vulnerable areas. And we're just repeating what took place on Erie Shore Drive, which I think we can all agree if we could have prevented or worked more proactively with residents in any way, it may have been beneficial to the people in our community. So I do have some questions around that and also the recommendations. Through the mayor, I believe to Mr. Kelly, who is it that regulates what homeowners individually are able to do to protect their properties from shoreline erosion?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So that is all managed through the Lower Thames Valley Conservation Authority. Depending on the extent of the work, if it's primarily on the shoreline, it's managed almost solely by the Lower Thames. However, if it's work that's in the water, it will also require potential other government agencies such as MNRF and also Fisheries and Oceans.
Okay, thank you. And then just to comment that I do recognize that there's lots of work happening with multiple levels of government. I think that adding item number 6 really challenges our EMT members to identify creative solutions and also to engage further with community members around what opportunities are or what areas of support they can provide to them. Just before this council, I spoke with a resident who lives on Talbot Trail, very near the closure or in the closed area, who's lost about 20 feet of her property and had shared with me how she has reached out to a number of engineering firms and coastal engineering organizations to try to understand what options she has, and just feels like she's kind of being punted from one place to another with where it is she needs to go. So even applying some of the service models we have to our small businesses to some of these residents and communities in terms of what their options are or what they could do. Because let's face it, some of the dollar signs around what it is that we could do and the 50-year timeline, you know, these problems aren't going to be solved tomorrow. We have a number of people who are going to live out potentially the rest of their lives in a vulnerable area along Lake Erie, and we need to understand what they can do to help maintain their properties in addition to looking at those long-term solutions. So thank you. That's all I have to say.
Councillor Sakachi, followed by Councillor Solomon.
Thank you, through your worship. This question is going to be to Mr. Kelly. In number 2, let me just see here, number 2B, sorry, 1B, when they're talking about Erie Road, is there going to be conversations with our local utility providers, for instance, like Integris, to see what the potential was going to be to alternate the power source that goes to Erie? Obviously, we're well aware that we had to bring some generating stations there. Is that going to be some stuff that's going to be included in the phase 2 of the study, or are you going to be looking at this in that cost as well?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. The intent here with our proposal was to just focus on the erosion protection of that particular area as identified in the Peter Zuzak's report. it wasn't to go beyond looking at the Integris Ontario Hydro One issues that exist.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you very much, Thomas. Is that something that will be conversated on eventually though? Because obviously that is something that we need to consider. And I respect that this is more around the erosion aspect, but obviously that's a very important aspect to our community on the water.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So I can pass your concerns along to our colleagues at Integris and to get their comment if there's things, continuous improvement initiatives they may have as well planned for the future.
Thank you for that. And I do want to acknowledge, I thought it was very comforting to know that Mr. Epp reached out to me on a Saturday to discuss the fact that he had he took the time to read through the report, and it's very nice to know and comforting to know that he is being very diligent in this matter, and that is greatly appreciated. But my question is going to be to Mr. Quinton, if he could touch base on a quick question. So we're seeing all these astronomical numbers. How, as a community, the size that we are and already facing so many detrimental components, how are we able to phase some of these large astronomical numbers in? Now, are you guys going to be going back and working on different ways that we can start putting a program together? Because obviously we can't pay for this kind of stuff in a lump sum. So I just kind of wanted to touch base on Mr. Quinton, if what his perspective is on this report, and to see kind of the functionality of what his team is going to be doing from this, from a funding standpoint.
Thank you, Mayor Caniff. It's Gord Quinton, Chief Financial Officer speaking. Yeah, so recommendation number 2 is in the report for that very reason, that there's no way of, whether it's the homeowners, the property owners all along there, and the municipality, being able to go at this alone, or if you look at even the discussion of moving the sand over at Erie to the beach that's eroding. We need partners at the federal and provincial level to make all these actions feasible. There's a lot of different partners that were in the funding of the Zuzak report, as you know, and for the last while, the message has been to wait for the results of the Zuzak report before we can make decisions. Now that we have the Zuzak report and the final version coming shortly, now's the time for administration to and council to actively engage both the provincial and federal governments to see what can be done. The general answer is, well, there's no programs that it fits into right now. But that's where we need to convince them that there needs to be a program and it's not necessarily just for Chatham-Kent, obviously into Essex County and Leamington. There's a larger region that's in need of Lake Erie shoreline protection, especially at the western basin of Lake Erie, and we need to go at it together to the provincial and federal governments and show the need for assistance. The options are otherwise are for the homeowners and property owners to do it alone, or for all the property owners in Chatham-Kent to pay pay for it. And with the numbers that we're talking in the 200 million plus range, that's a very large high ticket item for Chatham-Kent taxpayers to do it alone. And in fact, I would say it's probably not possible. So we need help.
Thank you, Mr. Quinton, and I share your sentiment exactly. And I just want to, wrap up with a quick comment: is that I think a lot of things have been, regarding erosion and stuff like this. Something that can no longer be kind of ignored. That now that we have this great report on our at our hands, I think we need to utilize it the best we can in the advocation, because you said it perfectly. Our residents cannot do this alone, whether that be, on the Dyke Road, whether that be Erie Shore, the Erie Shore Drive story, whether that be, in Erie, they can't do it themselves. The municipality can't do this themselves. And I really, really hope that we go all in as much as we need to ensure that we utilize this report to the best of our advantage, to ensure that our residents, our municipality is protected the best we can, along the shorelines. And I really thank Thomas Kelly and his team, Mr. Zuzak, and I really appreciate your answers to your question, to my question, Gord. Thank you very much.
I just want to note that the revised motion is on the screen, which includes number 6, which Councillor Harrigan has added. We'll go to Councillor Solomon, followed by Councillor Thompson.
Your Worship, I was about to bring this motion, and I'm quite happy with the addition of number 6. I think we've thoroughly discussed this over the last 3 hours. I can't imagine that there's anything else that we need to discuss, because this is the recommendation that flows out of all the discussion we've had for 3 hours. So I'm hoping that we proceed now rapidly to pass the motion and move forward. The bottom line of this is, and I think everybody should recognize it, all politics aside, this cannot be done by the taxpayers at Chatham-Kent in any way, shape, or form. This problem goes all the way to Turkey Point and beyond. If you see today's Globe and Mail, you'll see that they're saying the same things down in Port Dover and Turkey Point that we're saying. So this is a provincial, federal problem, not a municipality of Chatham-Kent problem that we can solve. We just do not have this kind of tax base or the funding. So I hope we move rapidly to pass this motion, and hope discussion ends quickly. That's it.
Okay, yes, Councillor Solomon, I have 2 more on the speakers list. Councillor Thompson, followed by Councillor Latimer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. I've had a lot of questions from residents who don't really understand the Drainage Act process. So I was hoping that perhaps Thomas could walk us through just a real high level, how it would roll out, or how he would see that roll out, and what homeowners would be responsible for.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I have my colleague Tim Dick on the line, who's been dealing with the Act for about 30 years, so I'm going to let him answer that question. Thanks.
That's wonderful.
Thank you, Mayor Caniff and Thomas. So that's a pretty broad question, Councillor, with respect to how it works. Basically, the Act is a communal process which allows property owners to gain access to drainage or other drainage related features that will help them improve their properties. The concept is that in doing so, they will pay their fair share, but in addition, others who are affected or who are deemed to benefit will pay their share as well. So with all of that said, the process is such that Drainage Act works are initiated through petition. Under the Act, it's a legal process by petition, which is, by the way, what we've recommended in this case. The petition process allows property owners rights. It doesn't mean that people who aren't on the petition won't be deemed to be part of a project. So it's very important in this particular case, and I'm sure that others may have questions. I've thought about these, we've discussed these, and I expect that there may be other questions. In the case of Erie Shore Drive, the key terminology is related to the shoreline from what we've heard mostly tonight and in the past. So the property owners would then be allowed to initiate a project along the shoreline through a petition process, which would lead to the appointment of an engineer. Council would appoint the engineer based on recommendations that we would make, quite likely administration would make. The concept of that is that the engineer is responsible to be objective, to be non-biased completely in his or her approach to writing a report. The main reason for that is because that engineer is tasked with the responsibility of deciding important things like not only the design components of the project, what will be done, but also who will pay and to what proportions, including the municipality. So the municipality is deemed in almost every case, and you've heard me say, councillors have heard me say in the past, municipality typically pays anywhere from 10 to 20% on most projects. In projects such as this, they may pay more. So I could really go on here, Mr. Mayor Caniff, for an hour. I probably will stop there and see if there are any follow-up questions.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was more of more of a nuts and bolts question. People are concerned that if they sign the petition, they're immediately locked in for their approval without knowing costs or without knowing what the scope of the project is. But just because you sign the petition at one point doesn't mean you're locked into that standpoint. Is that true?
So thank you, Mayor Caniff. There are opportunities, that's true. There are opportunities within the process for property owners to take their names off the petition, and likewise for other property owners to add their names to the petition at various phases through the process.
Right. Okay. And in a nutshell, and just again on a broad viewpoint here, you're basically responsible for the cost and associated benefit to your property, right?
Mayor Caniff, that's correct. So there are different ways that engineers deem who pays what. They can be based on frontage, they can be based on the area of your property, or they can be based on other things like what are known as benefit and special benefit. So projects such as this can get complicated in terms of assessment rationale, because different factors come into play depending on whether you're a residential property owner, you're a road authority, or you might be an agricultural property owner. So you would pay based on your deemed benefit by the independent engineer appointed.
All right. I guess, again, not holding you to it, but just to clarify a little bit, and I'm sorry I'm going on so long about this, but people have asked, having a road run to your community or in front of your house isn't so much a benefit to you. That's more of a municipal responsibility. Some people are concerned they'll be subsidizing the road into their community.
So Mayor Caniff, thank you for the question again. I would answer that question, Councillor, that no, the road authority would pay for the existence and the benefit derived by the road and the property that the road authority occupies within that area that's within that drainage feature and area being drained.
Okay, excellent. Final question for you, Mr. Dick. The length of time. Some residents are curious if all the stars align and things move rapidly. How long of a process would we potentially be looking at before, honestly, construction could even start?
Thank you, Mayor Caniff. That's a difficult question, Councillor. Some Drainage Act because the Drainage Act is a communal process. And provides community scale solutions and community scale approaches, as we've heard Mr. Zuzak talk about. It also provides the opportunity for property owners to have input, also appeal if they disagree, or bring forward their ideas. So that is a strength of the process, but it can also be a drawback of the process. It's almost impossible for me to say that. What I can tell you, and I'll tell you this honestly, this is the most complicated project that I've seen. It's a very massive project, as Mr. Zuzek has alluded to, as Mr. Kelly's alluded to, as I've alluded to in the past. So to expect it to happen in a very short time frame, I think would be unrealistic. I think it's a process, step-by-step process where, you know, you've got to get a petition in place, appoint an engineer, move forward with the on-site meeting, and follow the process. But I would say it would be, you know, for sure, it would be at least a year to 2 years, for sure, and perhaps longer.
That's fine. That's all the residents were curious about. I think I have one final question in regards to the Talbot Trail. The length of the EA process. I think this would be a question for Mr. Kelly. Not only how much longer is it going to take, but what is the geographical range? People in Port Alma and at the end of AD Shad, curious if they're going to be included in this EA process for the Talbot Trail realignment.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I am checking on that right now, the exact geography. I will try to get you an answer here shortly if you can give me about 60 seconds.
Sure, I will just make a...
Yeah.
Yep, I will make a couple of comments then, and I will allow you to interject on the back side of things. I think because, as Mr. Zuzak points out, we are looking at a long geographical range on Talbot Trail, unfortunately, and I would hate to see us move the affected closure area in a couple hundred meters and call it a job well done, and then come back to another section in a few years. The old phrase goes, there's never time to do it right, but there's always time to do it twice, and I want that to avoid that. The only other thing I wanted to mention is we need to focus on what we can have an impact on. And I think Councillor Salmon made a very good point that lake levels and those issues and erosion is very much a provincial and a federal issue. We can't control the lake level of Lake Erie as much as we wish we could. We can't build a dam. We can't lower. We can't open locks. We can't make those adjustments. So we have to focus on what we can do, and that's try to address the issues in our municipality. So I think Mr. Solomon was quite right in those comments. Mr. Kelly, is that enough time for you?
Yes, it is. Thank you. So we're looking at a couple of phases. The immediate phase is going to be where the closure is at in that particular area, especially Port Road. And then the goal is to move it further to the east, right up to Cedar Springs and even Charing Cross Road. That's what we're looking at, that far to the east.
There you go. That is good for the people who are listening at home and have been messaging me from the AD Shad and Port Alma. Those are my questions. I'm looking forward to supporting all of these recommendations. Thanks.
Councillor Latimer is our last speaker.
Thank you. Through the mayor, I am also looking forward to supporting all of these recommendations. Thank you to Councillor Harrigan for adding that number 6. I want to, all my Drainage Act questions asked and answered fully through Mr. Dick and Councillor Thompson, but I want to piggyback on Councillor Sakachi and Solomon and Councillor Thompson's comments with regard to upper level government advocation for funds. Can you tell me when the next Southwest Ontario Shoreline Roundtable meeting is scheduled for? Because I think, as Mr. Zuzak said, it needs to be the entire region. It needs to speak to senior government levels and with regard to the development of standing funding programs. And we cannot do this alone. Mr. Epp very much, he reached out to me this weekend as well, and he sent a follow-up email to all of the councils or councillors saying, while there's no federal funding programs which are currently accepting applications, many communities have their applications ready for when new money is put into them, but projects are typically considered after the province has approved them for funding. We haven't heard from MPP Nichols this evening, but I assume he very much will be involved in the Southwest Ontario Shoreline Roundtable. So do we have an ETA on that next meeting?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. It's Thomas Kelly, General Manager of IES. We spoke about this today, And our target is to have a meeting before the end of June, before the summer break. Not confirmed yet, but that's our target.
Thank you very much, Thomas.
Okay, hearing no other questions, we'll put it to vote. We're just waiting on this end to get the voting mechanism up.
Okay, if council can please vote. Sorry, 1 second, council. Okay, council, please vote and hit submit. All votes are in and motion passes 18-0. Thank you for your patience.
Item 12, reading of the first and second bylaws. Councillor Solomon.
Moved.
Councillor Foss, would you second that?
I'll second that.
Okay, third and final reading. Councillor Hall, would you move it? Councillor B. McGregor, would you second it?
Moved. Seconded.
Okay, a resolution of council in closed session adjournment. Councillor C. McGregor.
Thank you, and through the mayor, I would move that Chatham-Kent Council adjourn to its next meeting to be held on Monday, May 11th, 2020, and that Chatham-Kent Council authorize itself to meet in closed session on that day to discuss any matters permitted by the Municipal Act.
Councillor Pinsino, would you second that?
I'll second it.
Anyone opposed? Hearing none, we're done tonight. Thank you.